Pull the door closed behind you, friend. Welcome back to Old Man Midnight. The kettle's warm, the fire's low, and the rain won't quit tonight. If you're new, hit subscribe and leave a comment telling me where in the world you're listening from and what time it is there. I read every last one. Now settle deep. Let the room go dark. 5 stories tonight. Long ones. Rest easy. Here we go. Story 1. A stranger left me this handwritten in the pages of an old Bible, and I have kept that Bible in a locked drawer of my desk for the better part of 30 years, and I read the pages inside it perhaps once a year. On a night like this one, when the rain is heavy and the road outside my window is dark and empty, the pages were written by a man who signed himself only as B. Colfax, and I believe, from the paper and the ink and the way the letters were formed, that they were written down at some point in the last decade of the 1800s. Now listen close. This is how B. Colfax told it, best as I can carry it forward to you. Benjamin Colfax was a piano tuner by trade. He worked, at the time of this story, out of a small clapboard rooming house in a fishing village on the northeast coast of Massachusetts in a town called Ashkello that I have never been able to find on any map, and which I have some reason now to believe was already beginning to slip off the maps even while Colfax was living there. Ashkello was, in his telling, a village of perhaps 300 souls set on a small crescent harbor between 2 granite headlands, with a lighthouse on the southern point and a congregational church at the north end of Main Street, and a long stone breakwater that the fishermen had built out into the bay in 1841. Colfax was 31 years old that winter. He was a bachelor. He had lost both parents to fever as a young man, and he had come to Ashkello from Boston 6 years earlier because he had heard from a fellow at the conservatory that there was a shortage of piano tuners along that stretch of the coast, and he had wanted, he wrote, somewhere quiet to place himself for a long while. He got what he asked for. Ashkello was as quiet a place as a man could have hoped for. The fishermen went out before dawn and came in at dusk, and their women mended nets on the porches of their little gray houses, and the children ran on the shingle beach in bare feet even in October, and the wind came off the water and made the tin roofs sing, and Colfax rode a small brown mare up and down the coast road 3 days a week to tune the pianos of the summer people who kept cottages along the shore, and 1 day a week to tune the little upright at the church. And the rest of the days he sat in his rooming house and read books and drank tea and looked out at the harbor and thought his own thoughts. He was, by every account of his own writing, a happy man, not a joyful man, not a laughing man, but a man who had found the shape of a life that fit him, and who was content to sit inside that shape until whatever came next came for him. The trouble began on a Tuesday in the middle of November of 1892. He rode out that morning on a call from a Mrs. Halliday who kept a summer cottage about 4 miles down the coast road south of the village. Mrs. Halliday's cottage had a good upright, a Steinway, that her late husband had shipped up from New York the year before he died, and Colfax had tuned that instrument twice a year for the last 4 years, and he knew the road to it as well as he knew the road to his own rooming house. The road south, out of Ashkello, ran along the top of the low cliffs above the beach for about 2 miles, then dipped down into a stand of scrubby pines for another mile, then came out onto a stretch of open salt marsh, and then, in the last half-mile before the Halliday cottage, ran along a small tidal creek that emptied into a shallow cove. There was, along the whole length of that road, only one bell. The bell hung from a wooden post at the fork where the coast road split off to the Halliday Drive. It was a small brass ship's bell, blackened by weather, with a length of tarred rope for a pull. Mrs. Halliday had put it up when she and her husband had first come to Ashkello in the late 70s to signal the ice house boy to bring up ice from the cold cellar down by the cove. The bell had been rung in the years since, perhaps 100 times. It was, to Colfax, a small familiar landmark. He passed it every visit. That Tuesday morning in November, he came around the bend of the coast road at about 10 in the morning, and he saw the bell at the fork, and he passed it, and he rode on. Except that 100 yards later he came to another bell. It was the same bell, same brass, same tarred rope, same wooden post, same fork in the road, though this fork ran off in a slightly different direction than the first one had. It turned inland, into a stand of pines. Colfax did not remember being there. He stopped the mare. He looked back. He could see 100 yards behind him the first bell at the first fork on the road he knew. He looked ahead. He could see 10 feet away the second bell at a second fork on a road he did not. He sat on the mare a long time. He was not, he wrote later, immediately frightened. He was puzzled. He had ridden this road twice a year for 4 years, and he had never seen this second fork. It was the sort of thing a man might have overlooked once, on a day when he was tired or distracted, but not the sort of thing a man overlooked 8 times in a row. Colfax was not a man who overlooked things. It was his professional habit to notice. A piano tuner's ear is a noticing ear, and the noticing does not stay in the ear only. It spreads to the eye, to the hand, to the mind. Colfax had noticed every rut in that road, every gate, every fence post, every dead tree with a crow's nest in it, over 4 years of quiet riding. There had not been a second bell before that Tuesday. He rode past it slowly. He did not take the new fork. He rode on to Mrs. Halliday's cottage. He tuned her piano. He drank the tea she gave him. He did not mention the second bell. He rode home in the afternoon. He passed the second bell on the way back. It was still there. He passed the first bell on the way back. It was still there. 2 bells, 1 road, 2 forks, 4 years of riding it, and only 1 bell until that day. He wrote it down in his journal that night. He wrote also that when he had passed the second bell on the way home, the tarred rope had been swinging very slightly, as though someone had just recently rung it. Now, Colfax was, as I said, a noticing man, and a noticing man, when he encounters a puzzle, tends to investigate. Over the next week, whenever his tuning schedule took him out of the village, he began to note down small oddities along the roads he traveled. He noted them in a little leather memorandum book he had carried since his conservatory days. He wrote, keeping accounts, making, in his own quiet way, a survey. The survey turned up more than he had expected. On the road east out of Ashkello, along the north shore of the harbor, there was a small stone marker at the head of a lane that led down to a fisherman's cottage. Colfax had ridden past that marker perhaps 200 times. It was carved with the initials of the fisherman's grandfather, who had built the cottage in 1861. Colfax knew the initials. He could have drawn them from memory. On the Wednesday after the second bell, he rode past the marker, and the initials were wrong. They were still initials. They were still carved into the same stone, but they were letters he did not recognize as the fisherman's grandfather's, and when he rode past the same marker on the way back, the initials were the ones he had always known. On the road west out of Ashkelon, up over the low hill and into the interior, there was, on the Thursday of that week, a small wooden footbridge across a brook that had never had a footbridge before. It was a good footbridge, well built, old-looking. It had moss on the handrails and a little worn place in the middle of each plank where feet had walked for a long time. It was there when Colfax rode out. It was gone when he rode back. On the road that ran up the coast north of the village, there was, on the Friday, a lane he had never seen before. It ran off to the west, up into a stand of birch trees, and there was a hand-painted sign at its mouth that said, in careful black letters, to Welmer's Point. Colfax had lived in Ashkelon 6 years. He had ridden past that spot perhaps 500 times. There was no Welmer's Point, there was no lane, there was no sign, until Friday. And when he rode back that afternoon, the sign was still there, but the lettering had faded, as though it had been standing for many years. And he could just barely read to Welmer's Point under a growth of lichen that had not been there in the morning. He did not turn down the lane. He did not ring the second bell. He did not cross the footbridge. He did not follow any of the new things his eye had begun to find on the roads around the village. He rode home each afternoon, and he ate his supper, and he sat by the window of his rooming house, and he watched the harbor go dark, and he wrote in his journal. By the end of that first week, he had written a sentence in the journal that he would come back to many times. The sentence was this: "The map is being added to." He believed, and I believe he was right, that the map of Ashkelon, or the map of the country around Ashkelon, or the map of the world in the small area within a day's ride of Ashkelon, was slowly, quietly, and without permission being added to. New things were being placed into it: bells, signs, bridges, lanes, small landmarks at first that a careful man might notice and a careless man might not. And Colfax, being a careful man, was noticing. He was, he wrote, less afraid than he perhaps should have been. He was curious. He wrote that the additions did not seem to be aimed at him personally. They were not, so far as he could tell, tricks played on his particular eye. They were, if anything, changes made to the world itself. The world was, in Ashkelon, that November, quietly adding to its own list of contents. And Colfax was one of the few people around who had been paying enough attention to see it happen. He decided, on the second Monday, to test something. He decided that he would ride out to the second bell, and he would ring it. He did not tell anyone. There was no one, really, to tell. He kept his own counsel. He saddled the mare in the gray dawn. He rode south out of the village. He came around the bend of the coast road. He passed the first bell. He rode on. He came to the second bell. He stopped. He got down off the mare. He took the tarred rope in his hand. It was cold. It was damp. He looked at the bell above him. Same brass. Same weathered patina. Same small dent on the rim, where the first bell also had a small dent on the rim. They were the same bell, or as near to the same as two bells could be, except that one of them had been at that fork all his life in Ashkelon, and the other one had not existed a week before. He pulled the rope. The bell rang. The sound was, he wrote, good clear sound, a bell sound. A high sharp note that hung in the cold air for perhaps 4 seconds before it began to fade. It was, he wrote, Exactly the sound the first bell made when the ice house boy rang it. He waited. Nothing came. No answer. No hoofbeats down the new fork. No voice. The pines along the new road stood still. The wind was low. The mare grazed at the roadside. After perhaps 5 minutes, Colfax got back on the mare, and he rode on to his morning's appointment, and he rode home in the afternoon, and he wrote in his journal that he had rung the second bell, and nothing had come, and that he was, he supposed, a little disappointed and a little relieved in equal measure. He should have paid closer attention to the disappointment. That is my own note, friend, added to his story. From the vantage of 30 years of thinking about it, he should not have felt any disappointment at all. That he did, that some small part of him had wanted an answer, had wanted a something to come down the new fork out of the new pines, was the first sign that Ashkellow was already beginning to work on him. The next week, the things being added grew larger. On the coast road south, on the Tuesday, there was a second cottage. It sat about halfway between the first fork and the Halliday Drive. It was a small gray cottage with a shingled roof, a stone chimney, and a low picket fence, and it had, so far as Colfax could tell, been there always. There was moss on the shingles. There was a well-worn path from the road to the door. There was a curtain in the window. There was smoke coming from the chimney. Colfax rode past it slowly. He wrote in his journal that evening that he had, in the moment of first seeing it, felt no surprise at all. He had felt only a mild interest, the way a man feels when he passes a house he has passed many times and notices, for the first time, that the door is a different color than he remembered. Only later, sitting in his rooming house, did he understand that the cottage had not been there the week before, or the week before that, or ever. He rode back the next morning on purpose to look at it again. The cottage was there. The smoke was there. He got down off the mare. He walked up the path. He knocked on the door. The door was opened by a woman he had never seen before. She was perhaps 50 years old. She had gray hair pinned up at the back of her head. She wore a dark blue house dress and a white apron. She looked at him with mild, polite interest. She said, "May I help you?" Colfax, who had rehearsed nothing, said the first thing that came into his head. He said, "Madam, I am the piano tuner from the village. I understand you have a piano that needs seeing to." The woman looked at him. She said, "We do not have a piano." Colfax said, "I beg your pardon. I must have been misinformed." The woman said, "That is quite all right. Would you care for a cup of tea before you ride on? The morning is cold." Colfax, who wanted very much to say no, heard himself say, "Yes, thank you," and he stepped through the door into a small, warm, perfectly ordinary parlor, with a fire in the grate and a settee against the wall, and a small round table set for two, and he sat down in one of the chairs, and the woman poured him a cup of tea, and he drank it, and it was good tea, and he sat with the woman for perhaps 20 minutes and talked about the weather and the fishing season and the price of coal. He did not learn her name. He did not ask her name. Every time he formed the question in his mind, some other question came out of his mouth instead, and by the time he understood what was happening, another 20 minutes had passed, and it was nearly noon, and he was, he realized, going to be late for the Halliday appointment. He stood up. He thanked her for the tea. She saw him to the door. At the door, she said, "Come back any time, Mr. Colfax." He had not told her his name. He wrote on. He tuned Mrs. Halliday's piano poorly, he wrote in his journal that night. His hand was unsteady, and his ear was distracted, and he found himself listening not for the notes of the instrument, but for a bell, a distant bell, that seemed to be ringing somewhere at the edge of his hearing. He rode home in the afternoon. The cottage was still there. He did not stop. Over the next weeks, the additions continued. A second church steeple began to be visible from the top of the northern headland, though there was no other village on the map within 20 miles that had a church. A new headstone appeared in the Ashkello Cemetery in a plot where Colfax had known no burial had been done. A headstone with a name he did not recognize and a date 1794 from a century before the town had been settled. A new alley opened between two buildings on Main Street that had, until that Thursday, been touching each other. The alley led to a small courtyard he had not known existed, in which there was a stone well, and around the well 4 wooden benches, and on one of the benches an old man in a blue coat sat reading a newspaper. Colfax did not go into the courtyard. He did not read what was written on the newspaper. He walked past the alley as though he had not seen it, and the next day the alley was gone, and the two buildings were touching each other again. He continued to write in his journal. He continued to make his rounds. He continued to tune pianos. He continued, on his afternoons off, to ride out into the country around Ashkello, and to see what new things had appeared and to note them down. He did not visit the second cottage again, though he passed it many times. The woman in the house-dress was sometimes at the window, and she sometimes raised her hand to him in a small, friendly wave, and he sometimes lifted his hat to her in return, but he did not stop. He wrote, in the middle of December, a passage that I have thought about many times over the years. He wrote that he had begun to understand what was happening. He had begun to understand, or so he believed, that Ashkello itself was being pulled into two Ashkellos. There was the Ashkello he had known for 6 years, the harbor, the church, the coast road, the lighthouse, and there was, being written slowly over it, a second Ashkello. Some of the second Ashkello overlapped the first exactly. Some of the second Ashkello was in different places. In some spots, the two Ashkellos were still separate, and a man could stand on the road and see only one. In some spots, they had grown together, and a man could no longer say which town he was standing in. He wrote that he believed the second Ashkello was slowly consuming the first, that every new bell and every new bridge and every new cottage was a piece of the second town being installed in the place of a piece of the first, and that eventually, if the process continued, there would be only one town again. And it would not be his town, it would be the other one. He wrote that he did not know what to do about this. He wrote that he did not know if there was anything to be done. He wrote that the last piano he had tuned in the village, at the church, had been out of tune again the next morning. Not by any human hand, but as though the wires themselves had loosened in the night, and that when he had opened the case to inspect it, he had found, sitting on the felt inside, a small brass bell. The bell had been the size of a walnut. It had had a tarred rope for a pull. It had been, in every detail, an exact miniature of the second bell on the coast road south. He had picked it up. He had held it in his palm. He wrote, felt the desire to ring it. He had not rung it. He had put it in his coat pocket, and he had walked home, and he had put it in the drawer of his writing desk, and he had not touched it again. The last entry in the pages I have is dated the 22nd of December, 1892. It is short. It reads only, "They have finished the second lighthouse. The light came on at dusk tonight." It is not our light. I do not know whose light it is. I do not think I will ride out tomorrow, and that is where the pages end. I have looked, friend, in many places for what became of Benjamin Colfax. I have looked in the census of 1894. I have written letters to the historical societies of every town along that stretch of the Massachusetts coast. I have looked at old newspapers from Boston and Gloucester and Salem. There is no record of a piano tuner named Benjamin Colfax living anywhere on that coast in that year or any year. There is no town called Ashkello. There is no small crescent harbor between two granite headlands where the maps say there should be one. The coast at that stretch runs straight for 9 miles between two other towns with no harbor at all. I have come to believe that Ashkello finished going, that the second town won, that whatever Colfax was watching in November and December of 1892 came to its conclusion, and the first Ashkello, the one with his rooming house and his mare and his rounds, was written over entirely by the second, and the second, when it was finished, was not on any map either, or perhaps it was on some other map. Perhaps it is on a map I have never seen. I have wondered sometimes, on nights like this one, whether Colfax finished being written over along with the town, whether some Benjamin Colfax is walking the streets of the second Ashkello to this day, 90 and some years later, still tuning pianos, still drinking tea in the parlor of the woman on the coast road south, still lifting his hat to her at her window, still not asking her name. I hope not. I hope he got out. I hope he saddled the mare on the morning of the 23rd and rode south down the coast road and did not stop until he came to a town that was still on a map somewhere, and that he lived out his life in some ordinary Boston boarding house, tuning ordinary pianos, and forgot Ashkello entirely. But he sent the Bible to somebody. Somebody found it. Somebody carried it and left it for someone else, and eventually a stranger left it for me. And in the drawer of my desk tonight, along with those pages, there is, folded inside a piece of tissue paper, a small brass bell the size of a walnut, with a tarred rope for a pull. I have never rung it, friend. In 30 years, I have never rung it. But some nights, when the rain is on the roof and the fire is low, and I am alone in this house with my own long thoughts, I sit at my desk and I open the drawer and I look at the bell and I close the drawer again. I do not know what would come if I rang it. I suspect I would not want to know. Sleep tight tonight, friend. And if you should find yourself on a country road tomorrow, and you should see a bell you do not remember, or a lane that was not there yesterday, or a cottage where no cottage stood, you do the same. Do not ring it. Do not walk the lane. Do not knock on the door. Some maps are being drawn a great deal slower than we would like to think. And once you are on the new one, I do not believe there is a way back onto the old. Now, let me tell you a little more about how Colfax lived, friend, because you need to understand the shape of his days before you can understand how the shape of them began to change. His room at the boarding house was on the second floor, at the back, with one window that looked out over a small yard where the boarding house kept a vegetable garden in summer and a woodpile in winter, and beyond the yard a stand of gray alders, and beyond the alders the northern headland and the open sea. He rose at 6. He dressed by lamplight, because in November the sun does not come up over the headland until well past 7. He went downstairs. The boarding house keeper, a widow named Mrs. Anstruther, set out his breakfast at 6:30 sharp, and it was the same breakfast every morning. 2 eggs fried in lard, thick slice of bread toasted over the fire, a piece of salt cod warmed in milk, and a pot of tea strong enough to stand a spoon in. Colfax ate this breakfast every weekday for 6 years, and he never tired of it. And Mrs. Anstruther never once asked him whether he might prefer something different, because she knew the answer. He read the Boston paper over breakfast when the paper came. It came twice a week by the afternoon mail wagon, so it was always a day or two old by the time he held it. He did not mind. The news of Boston, he wrote once, was not so urgent a matter that it could not wait a day. After breakfast, he saddled the mare. The mare was a small bay Morgan, 11 years old, named Pole, and she belonged to the boarding house, but had effectively become his by use, since nobody else at the house ever rode her. Pole was, Colfax wrote, the best-tempered creature he had ever shared a road with. She did not spook. She did not bolt. She did not, he noted later with some significance, ever seem to notice the new bells or the new lanes or the new cottages. She simply walked past them, head down, hooves steady, as though the roads she walked were the same roads she had always walked. Colfax wrote that he envied her this, eventually. He wrote that a horse lives in whatever world it finds itself in without arguing. A man does not have that luck. His work was slow and careful. To tune a piano properly in that era, with the tools of that era, took the better part of 3 hours, and Colfax never hurried it. He opened the case. He set his tuning fork. He went through the instrument note by note, string by string, in the slow spiral pattern he had been taught, beginning at middle C and working outward. He wrote that tuning a piano was the nearest thing he knew to prayer. A man alone in a quiet room with a wounded instrument, setting each string to its true pitch, one by one, until the whole thing rang together like a choir. He loved the work. He wrote that he never once, in all his years, wished he were doing something else. This, friend, is the life that the new bells and the new lanes came into. A life already perfectly shaped. And I have wondered, reading his pages, whether that was why it happened to him, whether whatever writes second towns over first towns looks for the quiet places, the settled lives, the men who have stopped asking questions, because those are the places where the changes will take longest to be noticed and will meet the least argument when they come. But I am ahead of the pages. Let me go back to them. There is a passage from early in the second week that I have not yet told you. On the Friday of that week, Colfax had an appointment at the lighthouse. The lighthouse keeper at Ashkello was an old man named Darius Trask, who had kept the light on the southern headland for 41 years and had been, in that time, out of the village only once a month to pick up his stores and to collect his pay. He was a widower, alone in the tower, and he was, by all accounts, perfectly content to be so. The light had a small pianola in the keeper's quarters, a player piano, wind-up, that Trask had bought second-hand some years before and could not keep in tune himself. And twice a year, in spring and fall, Colfax rode out along the breakwater to the point and spent a morning with the pianola, setting it right. That Friday morning, he rode out as usual. The breakwater was a quarter mile of flat granite blocks, wet with spray, and Pole picked her way along it carefully, as she always did. Colfax wrote that the sea was calm that morning, the sky high and gray, the gulls quiet. He reached the lighthouse. He tied the mare. He knocked at the door of the keeper's quarters. Trask opened the door. He was a tall man, stooped, with a white beard and pale blue eyes. He looked at Colfax for a long moment. He said, "You're early." Colfax said, "I don't believe so." We said Friday. Trask said, "We did." But the other tuner was here yesterday. Colfax stood in the doorway. He said, "The other tuner," Trask said. The young fellow from the village came out Thursday morning, tuned the pianola, was done by noon. Pleasant young man, gave him his tea and a bit of a dinner. I assumed you'd sent him. "Apprentice, I supposed," Colfax said. "Mr. Trask, there is no other tuner in Ashkello. There has never been any other tuner in Ashkello. I have been the only one for 6 years." Trask looked at him. The old man's eyes, Colfax wrote, did a slow thing then. They did not widen exactly, but they settled, the way a man settles himself against a wave he knows is coming. He said, "Well, then you had better come in and look at the pianola." The pianola was in tune. It was, Colfax wrote, very well in tune, better than he could have done it himself in the time. The work was good work, the kind of work a man does who has been tuning pianos for a long time and loves it. He went through the instrument himself anyway, carefully, note by note, and found nothing to correct, and that, he wrote, frightened him more than anything that had happened yet, because there was no second tuner, and the pianola was tuned, and Trask had given the man tea and a bit of a dinner, and had sat with him, and had found him pleasant. He rode back along the breakwater in the early afternoon, slowly, and he wrote that night that he had understood, for the first time, what the second Ashkello was. It was not a town replacing a town. It was a life replacing a life. Every piece of the second town that was being installed, every bell, every lane, every cottage, every headstone, was a piece of somebody's second life. The woman in the cottage, with no piano, was somebody's second neighbor. The other church steeple was somebody's second church. And the young tuner, the pleasant young fellow who did such careful work and drank his tea and was done by noon. The young tuner was somebody's second Benjamin Colfax. He wrote that he had sat up very late that night, in his room, with the lamp burning, thinking about the second tuner. He wrote that the thought that had first come to him, a wild thought, a nonsense thought, was that he ought to ride out and find the man, introduce himself, shake his hand, ask him where he had learned his trade. He wrote that he had known, immediately and with complete certainty, that he must never do this. He did not know how he knew. He knew only that he knew. The way a man knows not to look over the edge of a high roof. The way a man knows not to answer when a voice calls his name from an empty room. He wrote, whatever he is the one who gets to stay. When the writing over is finished, it will be his Ashkello, not mine, his rounds, his mare, his window over the yard. I understand this now. The bells and the lanes and the cottages are not the invasion. He is the invasion. The rest is only his furniture being carried in ahead of him. He wrote that he considered, that night, leaving, packing his valise, and taking the afternoon mail wagon to the junction and the train to Boston, and beginning again somewhere inland, somewhere far from any coast. He wrote that he sat with this thought for the better part of an hour, turning it over, and that at the end of the hour he understood that he would not leave, and that he had never truly intended to leave, and that the thought of leaving had only been a kind of courtesy his mind had paid to the idea of survival. He wrote, "I am too tired and too old at 31 and too settled. And besides, and this is the true reason, the one I would not say aloud, I want to see how it ends. I want to see his Ashkello. I have spent 6 years learning this town by heart. I want to watch it learn me back. The last week of his pages, friend, is the week I think about most. The additions came faster then. By the 18th of December, the whole of Main Street had changed. Not at once, not in a night, but shop by shop, sign by sign. The cobbler's shop was a milliner's. The milliners had been there, Colfax wrote, for as long as anyone could remember, though the week before it had been the cobbler's. For as long as anyone could remember, and the week before that, it had been the cobbler's, actually, and he had had his boots resoled there in October. He went in on the 18th and asked the woman at the counter how long she had been in business, and she said, "Oh, going on 11 years now," and smiled at him, and he bought a hat he did not need, and he went home, and he wrote in his journal, "I have bought a hat in a shop that did not exist last Tuesday, from a woman who has been there 11 years, and I cannot say which of those two facts frightens me more. What frightens me most, I think, is that they are both true. On the 20th, he wrote that Mrs. Anstruther had set out his breakfast at 6:30, as always, and that it had been 2 eggs fried in lard, and toast, and tea, but no salt cod, and when he had remarked on it, gently, she had looked at him strangely and said, 'Mr. Colfax, I have never served salt cod in this house. My husband could not abide the smell of it, God rest him.' And Colfax had eaten his eggs and his toast, and had said nothing more, and had written that night, 'Her husband has been dead 9 years. I have eaten her salt cod 200 mornings. She does not remember.' Or, and I must write this, though my hand does not want to, it is not her who does not remember. It is the second Mrs. Anstruther who has arrived, and she never served salt cod. Because her husband could not abide the smell of it, God rest him, and she has been keeping this boarding house for years, in her Ashkello, which is becoming the only Ashkello, and tomorrow, or the day after, or the day after that, a young piano tuner will come down her stairs at 6 in the morning, and she will set out his breakfast, and he will eat it, and he will not remember that there was ever a man before him who sat in that chair and read the Boston paper a day late and did not mind. The final entry, the one from the 22nd of December, I have already given you. They have finished the second lighthouse. The light came on at dusk tonight. It is not our light. I do not know whose light it is. I do not think I will ride out tomorrow. I want to tell you, friend, that there is one more thing. It is not in the pages. It is something I found years ago when I was trying to trace the Bible that the pages were folded into. The Bible was a small, black, leather-bound King James, printed in Philadelphia in 1871, and on the flyleaf, in a hand I believe to be Colfax's own, there is an inscription. It is not addressed to anyone. It reads only this, to whoever finds this: "The bells are the worst of it. Do not ring them. Do not let them ring you. If you live near a harbor, and one morning there are 2 lights, where there was one, go inland. Go inland the same day. Do not wait to see how it ends." I waited. I am writing this from a room that is mostly his now. The window is mine still, for a little while longer, and from it I can see both lights. The old one blinks twice, then rests. The new one blinks once, and rests longer. I find, to my shame, that I have begun to prefer the new one's rhythm. That is how I know it is nearly done. When a thing has taken enough of you, what is left of you starts to admire it. Goodbye. The mare was a good mare. Her name was Pole, and she never noticed anything. And I hope, wherever she is, that she still doesn't. That is all of it, friend. That is everything the stranger left me in the pages of that old Bible 30 years ago. I do not live near a harbor. I made sure of that a long time ago, but I keep the bell in the drawer, and I keep the Bible beside it. And on nights like this one, when the rain is on the roof and the house is quiet, I sometimes think I can hear, very far off, very faint, a single bell ringing over water. Once, then rest. Once, then rest. I do not go to the window to look for the light. I have never gone to the window. That, I believe, is the whole of why I am still here to tell you this story. Rest now. Let the rain do its work. There is more night ahead of us and more stories in it, and the fire, friend, is still warm. Story 2. I heard this told at a diner in Kentucky one October, and the teller wouldn't give his name. He was a long-haul man. You could tell it by the width of his shoulders and the sunburn on the left side of his face only, the trucker's tan, as they call it. And he sat 2 stools down from me at a little all-night place off the interstate, and somewhere between his second cup of coffee and his third, he started talking, and he did not stop for the better part of an hour. And when he was done, he paid for his coffee and mine both, and he walked out into the dark, and I never saw him again. Now listen close. This is how he told it, best as I can carry it forward. His name, though he did not give it to me, I will call him by the name on his cap, which said Dale. Dale was an owner-operator out of Amarillo, Texas, and for 19 years he had run the long desert routes of the Southwest, hauling freight between El Paso and Flagstaff, Albuquerque and Phoenix, down through the big empty country where the towns are 50 miles apart, and the land between them is nothing but mesquite and rock and sky. He knew those roads the way you know the floor of your own bedroom in the dark. He knew every truck stop, every way station, every stretch of bad pavement, every overpass where the wind came through hard enough to push a loaded rig half a lane sideways. The run this story is about was an ordinary one. It was October of 1987. He had a load of machine parts bound for a warehouse outside Phoenix, and he had left El Paso at 4 in the afternoon, figuring to drive through the night and deliver at dawn the way he had done 200 times before. He had a thermos of coffee. He had a cassette of Waylon Jennings in the deck. He had a sandwich wrapped in foil on the seat beside him, made by the woman he was living with at the time, whose name he also did not give me. He was 41 years old. He was healthy. He was not a drinking man, not on the road. He was, he said, about as ordinary a trucker as ever turned a key. The first strange thing happened at about 11 that night, on a stretch of 2-lane west of Deming, New Mexico, where the road runs straight for 40 miles through country, so flat and empty that on a clear night you can see the glow of the next town an hour before you reach it. The radio, which had been playing the country station out of Las Cruces, went to static. That was not strange. That stretch of road was a dead zone and always had been. Dale reached over to switch it off, and that was when he heard the voice. It came through the static. It was a low voice, a man's voice, and it was speaking very calmly, the way a man speaks when he is reading from a list. It said, "At mile marker 19, slow to 40, At the third arroyo, keep left. Do not stop for the dog. Dale took his hand off the radio. He sat up straighter. The static went on, and underneath the static, the voice said it again, word for word, in the same calm tone. At mile marker 19, slow to 40. At the third arroyo, keep left. Do not stop for the dog. Then the static cleared, and Waylon Jennings came back on. In the middle of a song, as though nothing had happened, Dale drove on. He told me he was not frightened. He was a practical man, and practical men who drive alone at night learn to file strange things away for later. A radio can pick up odd things in the desert. CB bleed, ham operators, skip off the ionosphere. He had heard weirder. He kept driving. But here is the thing, friend. He remembered the numbers. Mile marker 19, the third arroyo. The dog. He did not try to remember them. They were simply in his head now, the way a song gets in your head. And they stayed there, turning over slow. As the miles went by, he passed mile marker 19 about 20 minutes later. He did not slow to 40. He kept it at 60, the way he always did on that stretch. Nothing happened. He passed the arroyos. That stretch of road crossed 3 shallow arroyos, dry creek beds on low concrete bridges, and he knew them all. At the third one, he did not keep left. He held his lane. Nothing happened. And then, about 10 miles further on, in the headlights at the edge of the shoulder, he saw the dog. It was a big dog, some kind of shepherd mix, tan and gray, and it was standing at the side of the road, with one front paw raised, the way a dog stands when it is deciding whether to cross. Its eyes caught the headlights and shone green. Dale was doing 60. He told me, about 2 seconds to decide. He did not stop for the dog. He said he did not know why. He said he was not the kind of man to hit an animal on purpose, and there was room to break, and time, maybe, to slow enough to let the dog make up its mind. But the voice was in his head. Do not stop for the dog. And his hands, he said, simply did not move to the brake. He held the wheel straight. The truck went past the dog at 60 miles an hour, and in the mirror he saw the dog step back from the shoulder, unhurried, and sit down at the edge of the road and watch the taillights go. He told me that was the moment the fear started. Not the voice, not the static, the dog, because the dog had not flinched. 60,000 pounds of truck had gone past it at 60 miles an hour, 3 feet away, and the dog had not flinched. And dogs, Dale said, flinch. It is what dogs do. He had driven that desert 19 years. He had seen 100 dogs on 100 roadsides. Every one of them had flinched. He drove the rest of the way to Phoenix, with the window cracked and the radio off. And he delivered his load at 6 in the morning, and he slept 4 hours in the sleeper cab behind the warehouse. And he told himself when he woke that the whole thing had been fatigue and desert skip and a dog that was too dumb to know better. He picked up a return load that afternoon, crates of produce bound for El Paso. And at 4 in the afternoon he pointed the rig east, into the same desert, on the same road, the other way. The voice came back at 11 that night. Same stretch of road, eastbound now, same static, same calm tone, it said. At the rest area, take the cold plate. Do not take the hot plate. When the man at the fuel desk offers you the book, sign it. Do not read it first. Dale pulled over. He said he sat on the shoulder for 10 minutes with the engine running and the hazards on, and he tried to decide whether he was losing his mind. He was a man, he told me, who had never once in his life believed in anything he could not weigh on a scale. He did not go to church. He did not carry a rabbit's foot. he did not knock on wood, and he was sitting on the shoulder of a New Mexico two-lane at midnight, listening to a voice in static give him instructions about a rest area that was, if he remembered right, about 30 miles up the road. He remembered it right. He came to the rest area at midnight. It was a little state-run place, a low cinder-block building, with vending machines and a bulletin board and a row of picnic tables under a ramada, and at that hour it was empty except for one other rig parked at the far end of the lot, dark, with its running lights off. Dale parked. He went inside. He used the restroom. He washed his face. And on the counter of the little vending machine alcove, there were two paper plates, side by side, sitting on the counter between the coffee machine and the candy machine. On one plate was a sandwich, white bread, some kind of deli meat, wrapped in plastic, still cold. He could see the condensation on the plastic. On the other plate was a sandwich too, but this one was hot. He could see the steam rising off it. He could smell it. It smelled, he said, like the best sandwich he had ever smelled in his life, like every good meal he had ever eaten, wrapped into one. His mouth watered. His stomach, which had had nothing since a gas station burrito at 7, clenched like a fist at the rest area. Take the cold plate. Do not take the hot plate. He stood there a long time. He said he could not explain the next part to me, except to say that he had stopped believing the voice and started obeying it, and those were two different things, and the difference mattered. He took the cold plate. He left the hot one steaming on the counter. He walked out of the rest area with the cold sandwich in his hand, and he got into his cab, and he sat there, and he ate it, and it was the worst sandwich he had ever eaten. Stale bread, gray meat, something like cold grease congealed in the middle, and he ate every bite of it, because the voice had said to take it, and he was, by then, a long way past arguing. When he finished the sandwich, he looked back at the building. Through the little window of the vending alcove, he could see the counter. The hot plate was gone. He had not seen anyone come or go. The other rig at the far end of the lot was still dark, still silent, and it had, he noticed now, no plates on it, no DOT number on the door, no company name, just a black rig sitting at the far end of an empty rest area in the middle of the night, in the middle of the desert. He left. He drove east. And at the fuel stop outside Deming, the big one, the one he always used, he filled his tanks and went inside to pay, and the man at the fuel desk, a man Dale had seen 100 times, a heavy-set man named Gus, who always had a toothpick in the corner of his mouth, slid a book across the counter at him. It was a logbook. Not the kind truckers keep. This was a big old ledger, leather-bound, thick as a Bible, with yellowed pages. Gus said, "Sign it." Dale said, "What for?" Gus said, "Everybody signs." Then Gus looked at him, and Dale said the toothpick was not moving, and Gus's eyes were not blinking, and the whole man looked, for just that moment, like a photograph of Gus, printed out and stood up behind the counter. When the man at the fuel desk offers you the book, sign it. Do not read it first. Dale signed it. He told me his hand was shaking so hard the signature was barely legible, but he signed it on the next open line, under a column of names that went down the whole page in handwriting from a dozen different decades. He did not read the names. He wanted to. He said the wanting to read it was like the smell of the hot sandwich. It pulled at him, physically, like a hand on his sleeve. But he did not read it. He signed, and he slid the book back, and Gus blinked, and the toothpick moved, and Gus said, "Drive safe, Dale," the way he had said it 100 times before, and Dale walked out into the night and got in his truck and drove. He made El Paso at dawn. He delivered the produce. He went home. He did not sleep. He told me he spent the next week trying to find out what he had signed. He went back to the fuel stop on his next run west 4 days later, and Gus was there, and Dale asked him about the book, and Gus looked at him with his ordinary Gus face, toothpick working, and said, "What book?" And Dale said, "The Ledger, the one you had me sign last Thursday night." And Gus said, "Dale, I have never in my life had a book at this desk. You feeling all right? You look tired." He did not ask again. But here is the part, friend, where the story turns, and I want you to follow it carefully, because the man at the diner told this next part slower than all the rest, and he looked at his coffee the whole time he told it. Dale kept driving that route. He could not afford to give it up. It was his contract, his living, and the voice kept coming. Not every night, not even every run, but often enough, and always in the static on that same dead stretch west of Deming, and always in the same calm tone, and always instructions. Small ones, practical ones. Take the second exit, not the first. Fuel at the truck stop with the green sign, not the blue one. When the trooper waves you over at the scales, do not roll your window down all the way. Sleep at the motel with the orange roof. Do not sleep at the one with the pool. And Dale obeyed every time, because, and this is what he said to me, and I have turned it over many times since, every time he obeyed, nothing happened. And the one time, early on, that he had not obeyed, the dog, he had seen the thing that happened instead, the thing that sat down at the roadside and watched him go with eyes that did not flinch. He had understood, without being told, that the voice was not the threat. The voice was the fence. The voice was the only thing between him and whatever the desert had decided he owed it. He ran that route 9 more years. He said he signed the book 4 more times in those 9 years. Always at different fuel stops. Always offered by a different man behind a different counter. Always the same ledger, the same yellowed pages, the same column of names in handwriting from a dozen different decades. He never read it. He never once read it. He said it was the hardest discipline of his life, harder than quitting the bottle, which he had also done some years before all this. And then, in the spring of 1996, he ran his last load west. He had sold the rig. He had taken a local job, short hauls, home every night. He was 50 years old, and he was done with the desert. And on that last run, on that last night, on that same dead stretch of 2-lane west of Deming, the radio went to static one final time, and the voice said, "You have done well. Your account is closed. There is one last thing. On the eastbound shoulder, a quarter-mile ahead, there is a car with its hood up. A woman is standing beside it. Stop for her. She is the reason." Dale said he came around the next bend, and there she was. A dark sedan, hood up, hazards blinking, and a woman standing beside it in the cold desert dark, waving her arms at his headlights. He said every instinct in him, after 9 years, said, "Do not stop." He said the desert had taught him that nothing on that road at midnight was what it appeared. But the voice had never lied to him. Not once in 9 years. The voice had kept him alive, or kept him whole, or kept him whatever he still was, through 100 nights on a road that wanted him. And the voice had said, "Stop for her. She is the reason." He stopped. He said he pulled onto the shoulder ahead of the sedan, and he set the brake, and he climbed down out of the cab. and the woman came toward him out of the dark, and she was maybe 40, maybe 45, in a denim jacket, and she was crying, and she said, thank God, I've been here 2 hours, nobody would stop. And Dale said, ma'am, what's the trouble with the car? And the woman stopped walking about 10 feet from him, and she looked at him, and she said in a completely different voice, a calm voice, a man's voice, a voice he knew better than his own by then. She said, you read the names. Dale said he did not remember getting back into the truck. He remembered driving. He remembered the desert, going past the windshield, mile after mile, and the static on the radio, which stayed on all the way to El Paso, and never spoke again. He told me there in the diner that he had not read the names. He knew he had not read the names. He had never once read the names in 9 years and 5 signings. But the thing in the denim jacket had said he had, and Dale said he had lain awake some nights since, wondering whether there was some moment, some sleepy second at a fuel desk at 3 in the morning, some glance down at the open page as he slid the book back, when his eyes had caught a name or two without his mind admitting it. Because he could remember now that the handwriting in the book had been familiar. All of it, every name in that column, in handwriting from a dozen different decades, had been written, he was almost sure, in the same hand, a hand he recognized, a hand like his own. He finished his coffee. He would not tell me anything more. Not what he thought it meant, not where he was hauling now, not even his real name. He said only one more thing, and he said it to his coffee cup, not to me. He said, she is still out there, the car with the hood up. I drive the local routes now, East Texas, nothing west of Abilene. But the men I know who still run the Deming stretch, they tell me, there is a car on the eastbound shoulder some nights, with the hazards on, and a woman beside it, and she is always crying. And the ones who stop, he said, the ones who stop don't come back down that road the same. They get quiet. They get careful. They start obeying voices in the static. And after a while, you ask them about it, and they just say the same thing I am telling you. He said, somebody has to read the names. That is the toll, and the only way to pay it is to not know you have paid it until the desert tells you that you have. Then he put a $10 bill on the counter, and he nodded to me, and he walked out into the October dark, and I heard a big diesel start up in the lot, and the lights of it swept the diner window once, and then he was gone. I have thought about that story a long time, friend. I do not know what the ledger is. I do not know what the voice is, or who it belongs to, or whose account it is keeping. But I know this. There are roads in this country that are older than the maps that show them, and older than the towns they connect. And on some of those roads, the price of safe passage is not money. It is attention. It is obedience. It is the small daily discipline of doing as you are told by a voice you cannot see, and never once asking why. And if you are ever driving at night, out west, on some long empty 2-lane, and your radio goes to static, and a calm voice begins to read you a list. Friend, you listen to it. You do every last thing it says, and if a book ever comes sliding across a counter at you, you sign it. You sign it, and you do not read the names. Not even one. Not even your own, especially not your own. Now let me back up and give you the parts of Dale's story that came out slow. There, at that diner counter, in between the main pieces, the parts about the life itself, because you cannot understand what a voice in the static means to a man until you understand the silence it came out of. Dale had been on the road since he was 22 years old. He had started as a dockhand in Amarillo, loading trailers by hand in 110-degree summers, and he had worked up to a driver's seat the slow way, the way men did it then. A borrowed run here, a second seat there, until a man named Coker, who owned 3 trucks, took a liking to him and put him on the Lubbock route full-time. He bought his first rig in 1974, a cab-over Freightliner with 200,000 miles already on her, and he paid her off in 6 years. And the night he made the last payment, he sat in the cab in his own driveway and drank a beer and cried. He told me, just a little, just the once, and then he wiped his face and went inside and never mentioned it to anybody, until he mentioned it to me, a stranger, in a diner in Kentucky 13 years later. That is the kind of man he was. The road had him, not in a bad way. He was not running from anything, he said. He was not one of those drivers with 3 ex-wives in 3 states and a child support order chasing him across the country. He had a little house in Amarillo. He had the woman he lived with, who he called his missus, though they had never married. He had a dog at home, a real one, an old blue heeler named Socks, who waited at the gate for him every Friday. He had a life, but the life was shaped like the road, 4 days out, 3 days home. Every week, for 19 years, the same shape, and he told me the shape suited him, that there were men who needed a crowd around them to feel real, and men who needed a windshield. And he had been born the second kind. He knew the desert the way a preacher knows a Bible. He knew where the mule deer crossed at dusk, south of Lordsburg. He knew which truck stop coffee would keep and which would strip the lining off your stomach. He knew the names of the waitresses at the places he stopped, and they knew his, and they knew he took his eggs over medium and his hash browns burnt. He knew that the stretch of 2-lane west of Deming, the dead stretch, the one in this story, had a way of playing tricks on a man's eyes after midnight, and that every old-timer on that route had a story about it, and that none of them told the stories sober. He told me about one old man, a driver named Polk, who had run that stretch in the 50s and 60s, back when it was the main highway. Polk had told him years before, over a piece of pie in a Tucumcari truck stop, that the road between Deming and the Arizona line had a toll on it. Not a money toll, an attention toll. Polk had said, the road lets you pass if you notice it, if you drive it 100 times and never once really look at it, never learn its markers, never count its arroyos, never know its mileposts, the road takes offense. And a road that takes offense, Polk had said, starts leaving things out for you, things to see, things to stop for, things to pick up. And the day you stop for the wrong thing, the road has you, and your name goes in the book, and after that you belong to the road, and the road drives you the way you used to drive it. Dale said he had laughed at Polk. He said Polk had not laughed back. Polk had just eaten his pie and pushed the plate away and said, "You'll see, boy, when it picks you." And Dale said he had not thought about that conversation again for 6 years, until the night the radio went to static and the voice said, "At mile marker 19, slow to 40. He told me about the routines he built after that first night, the disciplines, because that is what they became, disciplines, the way a monk has disciplines. He kept a notebook on the dash. Every time the voice came through, he wrote down what it said, word for word, with the date and the mile marker. He filled 4 notebooks in 9 years. He showed me the current one that night at the diner He had it in his jacket pocket, a little spiral-bound steno pad, soft at the corners, the cardboard cover gone dark with handling. He did not let me open it. He just held it up so I could see it, and then he put it away, and he said, 4 of these, and every instruction in every one of them I have followed, every single one. That is the whole of my religion now, friend. That notebook, that voice. 19 years I believed in nothing, and now I believe in a voice in the static on a dead stretch of road, and I cannot tell you if the voice is God or the devil or the road itself. I can only tell you it has never once been wrong. He told me about the other drivers, because he had started to notice them, after a while, the other ones who heard the voice. He said you could tell. It was in how they drove. There was a way of driving that road that the hearing men had. A deliberateness. They slowed. At places there was no reason to slow. They took the second exit when the first was the good one. They fueled at the wrong truck stop, the one with the green sign, the one with higher prices and worse coffee, and they did it every single time, without fail, like it was written down somewhere. And at the rest areas, at 2 in the morning, you would see one of them standing at the vending machines with a paper plate in his hand, eating a cold gray sandwich and looking at nothing, and you would know. You would know that man had a notebook in his jacket. You would know that man had signed the ledger, and you did not speak to him, and he did not speak to you, because there was a rule about it, an unwritten one, the same rule that had kept Dale from asking Gus about the book a second time. You did not talk about the road's business off the road. The road did not like it. He broke that rule that night in Kentucky with me. I have wondered why. I think a man can carry a thing like that only so long, and 9 years of notebooks and cold sandwiches and unanswered questions had filled him up past the top, and I was a stranger, and the diner was 1,000 miles from the desert, and the rain was coming down outside, and some things just spill over. I do not think he told me because he wanted to warn me. I think he told me because he could not hold it any more. But the warning came along with it. Anyway, the way the bones come along with the meat. There is one more thing he told me near the end that I have not put in yet, and I will put it here, and then I will let his story rest. He said that in the summer of 1993, he had been running east through the dead stretch at about 1 in the morning, and the voice had come through the static and said only one sentence. It said, "Tonight you may ask one question." Dale said he had driven a long time without asking anything because he was afraid to waste it. And then, finally, keeping his eyes on the road, he had said out loud to the empty cab, to the static, "Whose voice are you?" And the static had gone quiet, not off, just quiet, the way a room goes quiet when someone is deciding whether to answer. And then the voice had come back, calm as ever, and it had said, "I am the first one who stopped for the dog." Dale said he did not ask anything else. He said the answer sat in the cab with him all the rest of the way to El Paso, like a second man in the passenger seat, and it has sat with him every night since, in the bunk, at the house, everywhere. The first one who stopped for the dog. 19 years on that road, and the voice had been there longer than the road. Maybe. Maybe it had been the road's voice since the road was a wagon track. Maybe every voice that ever warned a traveler on that stretch was just the last man who had failed to be warned, paying the toll forward, paying it backward, paying it down the years, one calm instruction at a time. He said, "That is why I obey it." not because it has never been wrong, because it is one of us. It is somebody who stopped when he should have driven and read what he should have left unread, and it is stuck out there in the static doing penance for it, and the penance is keeping the rest of us alive. And the least I can do, the absolute least, is listen. Then he was quiet a while, and the diner hummed around us, and the rain came down on the parking lot, and finally he pushed his cup away and said the last thing, the thing about the woman and the names, which I have already told you, and he paid and he left. I never saw him again. But I will tell you this, friend. I asked a man I know, few years back, a man who runs freight out of El Paso, who knows that whole country. I asked him casual over a beer whether he had ever heard stories about the stretch of 2-lane west of Deming. And this man, who talks the way most men breathe, went quiet, and he looked at his beer a long time. And then he said, "Lo, I fuel at the green sign. I don't know why. I just always have." And I did not say another word about it. Some doors, friend, you knock on once, and some you learn from the sound on the other side to leave shut. Rest easy now. The road tonight is not your road. Your bed is close, and the rain is kind, and there are 3 more stories in me yet before I let you go. Story 3. This story sat in my journal for 40 years before I understood it, and I will tell it to you now the way it was told to me, on a front porch in the Ozark Mountains of Arkansas in the summer of 1962 by an old cemetery groundskeeper named Hosea Breedlove, who had kept the burying ground of a little holler called Whetstone Gap for going on 50 years by then. Now listen close. This is how it happened, best as I can tell it. Hosea Breedlove came to Whetstone Gap in the spring of 1913, a young man of 22 with a strong back and no family and a willingness to do work other men would not do. The Gap was a hard little place then, a scatter of cabins and one church and one store, strung along a creek between 2 steep ridges, the kind of holler where the sun came up late and went down early, and the people buried their own dead on a hillside plot behind the church because the nearest proper cemetery was 11 miles of bad road away. The previous groundskeeper, an old man named Tuttle, had died that winter, and the church needed somebody to take the job, and Hosea, passing through on his way to nowhere in particular, took it. He told me he had figured to stay a year. He stayed 50. The job was simple, and he did it well. He mowed the hillside in summer. He cut brush in fall. He dug the graves 6 feet down in ground that was more rock than soil, and he did it with a pick and a shovel and a patience that the people of the Gap came to respect the way you respect weather. He lived in a little 2-room shed at the bottom of the cemetery hill, with a stove and a cot and a table and a shelf of books he read by lamplight, and he kept the burying ground cleaner than most men kept their houses, and he asked little and he bothered no one, and the people of the Gap, who were slow to take to outsiders, took to Hosea Breedlove. Here is the thing about a burying ground in a place like that, friend. It is not like a city cemetery. It is a family plot the size of a hillside. Everybody in it is related to everybody still living, by blood or by marriage or by feud. Hosea learned them all. He knew where every stone stood and what it said. He knew that the Combses buried on the east slope and the Rainwaters on the west, and that the 2 families would not be planted side by side even in death, and that old Miss Fanny Coulter, who had outlived 3 husbands, had picked out her spot herself under the big oak at the top of the hill, and made Hosea promise to keep the grass short on it, which he did for 31 years, before she ever needed it, and 9 years after. He knew the dead of Whetstone Gap, the way I know the stories in my head. And that, friend, is where this turns. Because in the spring of 1926, on a wet April morning, Hosea was up on the hillside with his scythe, and he heard a voice behind him say, "Morning, Hosea." He turned around, and standing there, between the rows of stones, was Delmar Coots now. Delmar Coots had been a farmer up at the head of the holler, a big raw-boned man with a laugh you could hear across a cornfield. Hosea had dug his grave himself 3 weeks before, 6 feet down in the red clay of the east slope next to Delmar's father. Hosea had shoveled the dirt in on top of the coffin himself, had heard it drum on the lid the way a groundskeeper does. There was no mistake to be made. Delmar Coots was dead and buried, and Hosea had done the burying. And there he stood, in overalls and a flannel shirt, with his hat in his hands, saying, "Morning, Hosea," like a neighbor over a fence. Hosea told me, and he told me this part quiet, looking at his hands, that he did not run. He said he could not have run if he had wanted to, that his legs had simply declined the whole question. He stood there with his scythe, and he looked at Delmar Coots, and Delmar Coots looked back at him, friendly as you please, and Delmar said, "Fine morning for it, ground soft. Good digging weather, if you've got digging to do." And Hosea said, and he told me he did not know where he found the voice to say it. He said, "Morning, Delmar." And Delmar nodded and put his hat back on and said, "Well, I'll let you to it." And he turned and walked away down the hill between the stones, and Hosea watched him go. And at the bottom of the hill, by the old stone wall, Delmar stepped around the corner of the wall and was gone, not faded, not vanished in a wisp. He went around the corner of the wall the way any man would, and when Hosea got his legs back and went down after him, there was nobody there. Hosea sat down on the stone wall. He sat there a long time, and then he got up, and he went back up the hill, and he finished his mowing, because he told me, a man who finished his work, and he did not know what else to do with the morning. He did not tell anybody. Who would he tell? He went about his business. And 2 weeks later, he was up on the hill again, and he heard a voice behind him say, "That oak's taking over the Coulter plot, Hosea." And he turned around, and it was Delmar Coots again, standing easy between the stones. And they talked for 20 minutes about the oak, about the weather, about whether the creek would flood that spring. And Delmar was, Hosea said, exactly the man he had always been. Same laugh, same opinions, same way of spitting sideways into the grass when he made a point. And at the end of the 20 minutes, Delmar said, "Well, I'll let you to it." And he walked down the hill, and he went around the corner of the stone wall, and he was gone. It became a regular thing. That is the part of the story, friend, that I have never been able to set down easy. It became a regular thing. Every few weeks, then every week, then most mornings, Hosea would be up on the hillside with his tools, and Delmar Coots would come around and pass the time of day. And Hosea, who was, I remind you, a man of enormous patience and almost no fear, came to look forward to it. Delmar was good company. Delmar had been good company alive, and he was good company dead. And if the arrangement was strange, well, Hosea had lived long enough in the gap to know that strange things kept their own schedules, and a wise man did not interfere with a schedule that was not interfering with him. But here is where the shadow comes into it. Because about a year into these visits, on a gray morning, in early summer, Hosea said a thing he should not have said. They were standing by the Coulter plot, and Delmar was going on about the oak again, and Hosea, without thinking, said, "Easy, Delmar, you worry about that tree more than a living man would." And Delmar went still. Hosea told me it was the only time he ever saw the man go still. Delmar stood there with his hat in his hands, and the friendliness did not leave his face exactly. Something behind the friendliness came forward, and Delmar said, very quiet, "What did you say, Hosea?" And Hosea said, "Nothing. Forget it." And Delmar looked at him a long moment, and then the friendliness came all the way back, like a curtain being drawn. And Delmar said, "Well, I'll let you to it." And he walked down the hill and around the wall and was gone. But Hosea told me he understood in that moment the rule. He had not known there was a rule until he broke it. The rule was this: Delmar Coots did not know he was dead, and it was Hosea's job, it was somebody's job, and the job had fallen to Hosea, the way the mowing and the digging had, to make sure he never found out. I asked him that day on his porch how he could be sure. How he could be sure that what was visiting him was really Delmar's ghost, and not a harmless vision, or a trick of a lonesome mind, or a bit of bad shine somebody had slipped him. And Hosea looked at me a long time, and he said, "Because of the others, son. Because of the others, because after Delmar there were others." That is what Hosea told me, and it is the part of this story that has stayed with me 40 years. They came one or two at a time, over the years. Always people Hosea had buried himself, always recent, within a month or two of the burial, never longer. They would turn up on the hillside in the morning in the clothes they had been buried in, or the clothes they had worn working, and they would pass the time of day, and Hosea would pass it back, and he never once, after that gray morning with Delmar, let a word slip about what they were. He talked crops with dead farmers. He talked weather with dead storekeepers. He listened to dead women fret about their children, and dead old men complain about their rheumatism. And he nodded, and he kept the conversation easy, and at the end of every visit, every one of them said some version of the same thing, "Well, I'll let you to it," and walked down the hill, and around the corner of the stone wall, and was gone. He kept count in his head. Over the years, he said, he had buried 311 souls in that hillside, and of those 311, he had been visited by 52. Friend, he told me the number the way a man tells you a bushel count. He had had 52 morning visitors over 40-odd years. And he said, and this is where his voice went low, and he looked out at the road instead of at me. He said, I kept a list after a while, not of who visited, of who didn't. I asked him what he meant. He said, 52 came back, the other 259 stayed put, and I studied on it for years, trying to find the pattern, because there is always a pattern, son, in a burying ground. And I found it. Took me 20 years, but I found it. Every one of the 52, every single one, was a person who had died sudden, taken by surprise, a stroke at the plow, a fall off a roof, a fever that came and went in 3 days, a hunting accident, a baby that came too early and took the mother with it. Every one of them died with their boots on, so to speak, died in the middle of a sentence, and the ones who died slow, the ones who lay abed for weeks and months, the ones who had time to get used to the idea, the ones who said their goodbyes, and settled their accounts and closed their eyes on purpose. Those ones never once came back up the hill. Not one of them. They knew what had happened to them, you see. They had had time to know. It was only the sudden ones who didn't know. The sudden ones got up out of the ground, still thinking it was Tuesday. He stopped there, and he rocked a while, and I did not say anything, because there was nothing to say. Then he said, "And that is why the job matters, son. That is why somebody has to keep the burying ground in a place like this. It is not the mowing. It is not the digging. It is the mornings. Somebody has to be up on that hillside, knowing every name on every stone, ready to pass the time of day with whatever poor soul comes walking up out of the rows, not knowing they are buried in it. Somebody has to talk to them gentle. Somebody has to keep the rule, because the day one of them finds out, the day some fool looks at one of them and says, 'Delmar, you're dead. I buried you myself,' that is a day I do not want to be alive to see. I do not know what a man becomes when he finds out he is dead. But I have dug graves my whole life, and I will tell you this for free. There is room in that ground for whatever a dead man's grief might turn into. There is not room up here." He said, 52 of them, son. And I kept the rule with everyone, every single one. For 49 years I asked him, and friend, I wish now I had not, but I was young, and young men ask. I asked him, Hosea, did any of them ever figure it out on their own? And old Hosea Breedlove stopped rocking, and he looked at me with eyes that had watched 52 dead men and women walk down his hillside, and he said, One figured it out. He said it was Delmar Coots, the first one, the one who had come back so regular for so many years that Hosea had come to think of him less as a ghost and more as a neighbor. It was in the fall of 1958. Delmar came up the hill one morning, and he did not say morning, Hosea. He stood a ways off, between the stones, and he had his hat in his hands, and he said, Hosea, I want to ask you a thing, and I want you to answer me straight. And Hosea said, Ask it. And Delmar said, How long have I been dead? And Hosea told me, with his voice as steady as the day is long, but his old hands gripping the arms of that rocker, he told me that he answered the only way he could. He said, Going on 32 years, Delmar. And Delmar Coots stood there between the stones, and he looked down at his own hands, and he looked at the east slope where his grave was. And Hosea said the strangest thing happened then. The man did not weep. He did not rage. He did not come apart. He simply aged all at once. 32 years of death came into his face in about 4 seconds, like frost coming across a window, and when it was done he looked every year of it. Looked like a man who had been in the ground 3 decades, and he said, quiet, I wondered why the oak never got any bigger. And then he said, I thank you, Hosea. You were good company. You kept it from me a long time, and that was a kindness, and I won't forget it. And Hosea said, Where will you go? Delmar. And Delmar Coots put his hat on, and he looked down the hill, past the stone wall, past the creek, past the holler, at something Hosea could not see, and he said, Well, I'll let you to it. And he walked down the hill and around the corner of the wall, and he did not come back. None of them ever came back after that. Hosea told me the hillside went quiet that fall and stayed quiet, and the last 4 years of his keeping, before his hands gave out, he mowed and dug and raked alone in the ordinary silence of an ordinary graveyard, and he missed them, friend. He told me that plain. He missed them, 52 dead souls, and the old man missed their company like you would miss a choir. I asked him one more thing before I left his porch that day in '62. I asked him what he thought it meant, why the sudden ones came back, why they didn't know, where they went when they learned. And Hosea Breedlove gave me the answer that I have carried for 40 years, the answer I could not understand when I wrote it down, the answer that only began to make sense to me when my own hair went white. He said, "Son, I don't think they're lost. I think they're waiting." I think a man who dies in the middle of a sentence has to finish the sentence before he can go on to whatever's next. And the finishing takes time. And while it takes its time, he has to be somewhere, and he has to be somebody, and the kindest thing the living can do is let him be. Let him pass the morning on a hillside, talking about an oak tree. Let him think it's Tuesday. It cost us nothing, son. It cost us nothing at all, and it is the last thing on this earth we can do for them. He died the following spring, Hosea did. They buried him on his own hillside, up by the big oak, in the plot the church gave him for free, in thanks for 50 years. I was not at the funeral, but I got a letter from the preacher at Whetstone Gap. Some months later, a man I had corresponded with a little, and the preacher told me a thing that I will leave you with tonight. He said the new groundskeeper, a young fellow from over the ridge, name of Dodd, had come to him about a month after the burial, looking uneasy, and Dodd had said, "Preacher, I don't want you to think I'm losing my mind. But most mornings, when I'm up on the hill with the scythe, there's an old fellow comes around and passes the time of day. Real pleasant, talks about the mowing, mostly. Keeps telling me I ought to cut the east slope twice a week in the growing season, that it comes in faster than the west." And the preacher said, "Dodd, what does he look like?" And Dodd said, "Tall old fellow, overalls, kind eyes, carries his hat in his hands when he talks." And the preacher, who knew, because Hosea had told him years before and made him promise to keep the rule, the preacher said, "Dodd, you talk to him. You talk to him every morning, and you keep the conversation easy, and you never, ever tell that old man anything he doesn't ask to know. His name is Hosea. He kept this hillside 50 years, and he doesn't know he's done with it yet. And until he figures it out for himself, son," the preacher said, "you let him think it's Tuesday. Rest easy tonight, friend. The dead of Whetstone Gap are kind dead, if Hosea told it true. And I believe he did. I believe the ones who pass us on the road of a morning, or sit a while on our porch, or wave to us from a hillside, I believe most of them mean us no harm at all. They are only finishing their sentences, and the least the living can do, the very least, is keep the conversation easy and let them think it's Tuesday, and never, ever answer the question if they ask it. Let them ask the hill instead. The hill has time. The hill will tell them gentle when it's ready, the way it told Delmar, the way one fine morning it will tell old Hosea too. Let me tell you a little more about that hillside, friend, and about the man Hosea became on it, because a burying ground is not just a place in this story. It is the whole weather of the thing. The cemetery at Whetstone Gap sat on a south-facing slope above the creek, maybe 4 acres all told, fenced with split rails that Hosea replaced himself as they rotted, 1 rail every year or 2, so that the fence was never all new and never all old. There were 2 gates, the main gate at the bottom, off the church road, where the wagons and later the trucks came in with the coffins, and a little stile at the top, by the big oak that nobody used anymore, because the path from it had grown over sometime around the First War. The stones were mostly fieldstone for the first 50 years of the plot, flat gray rocks from the creek bed, with names and dates cut by whoever in the family had the steadiest hand. Later there were bought stones, marble and granite, hauled up from the railhead, and Hosea told me he could read the history of the holler's fortunes in the stones alone, the lean decades in fieldstone, the flush years in marble. He knew the ground itself like a man knows his own field. He knew that the east slope was red clay, slow digging, brutal in August when it went hard as brick, and brutal in March when it went to soup. He knew the west slope was kinda sandy loam over gravel, a grave you could open in a day instead of two. He knew there was a seam of shale under the top of the hill that had defeated 3 coffins worth of plans and forced the families to pick second spots. And he knew exactly how far down it lay because he had hit it with his pick enough times to remember the sound. He knew where the ground stayed wet after rain and where it drained by noon. He knew, friend, where every body in that 4 acres lay without a map, and when the church asked him once, in the 40s, to draw a map for the records, they said, in case something happened to him. He sat down with a pencil and he drew it from memory, every plot, every name, and the preacher checked it against the book and found 2 errors, and both of the errors, it turned out, were in the book. He was that kind of keeper, the kind of burying ground gets maybe once. I want to tell you about 3 of the 52. Hosea told me about many of them that long day on his porch, but 3 of them I wrote down in my journal that same night, word for word, as near as I could, because they would not leave me alone until I did. The first was a girl named Sarana Vess, who died in the winter of 1931 at 17 of a fever that came up on her between a Monday and a Friday. She had been a laughing girl, Hosea said, the kind that the whole holler minded less than it should have minded losing because it could not quite believe it had. She came to Hosea on the hillside about a month after the burial on a cold, bright morning, and she did not talk about the weather or the mowing. She talked about her mother. She said, "Mr. Breedlove, my mama is taking it hard, and I worry about her, and I want you to tell her." And here Hosea said he had to stop her, as gentle as he knew how, because a message like that, carried down the hill, would have broken the rule sure as shouting it. He said, "Sarana, your mama knows. Whatever you're wanting to say, she knows it already. That's how it works with mamas." And the girl looked at him, and she thought about it, and she nodded, and she said, "You really think so?" And he said, "I know so." And she said, "All right then. Tell the oak," I said, "to hurry up and shade my stone. The sun's been on it something fierce." And Hosea said he would, and he told me, on the porch, with the smallest smile an old man can carry. I did tell the oak. I told it out loud. Felt a fool. Did it anyway. And that tree, son, put out a limb toward the Vest plot the very next spring, and in 6 years her stone was in shade by 10 in the morning. You make of that what you will. I have made my peace with not knowing what to make of it. The second was a man named Obi Tolliver, who died in a sawmill accident in 1944, and who came back, Hosea said, angry. Not at Hosea, at everything. Obi had been cut off in the middle of his life at 38 with 3 boys at home and a mortgage, and his ghost walked the hillside with its jaw set and its fists in its pockets, and for the better part of a year he did not pass the time of day at all. He just walked, up and down the rows, Hosea said he would be mowing, and there would be Obi walking the far fence line, back and forth, like a man wearing a groove in a porch. And Hosea, who understood the rule better by then than anyone alive, did not ask him anything. He just worked, and one morning Obi stopped beside him and said, "Out of nowhere, I never finished the shed." Hosea said, "No." Obi said, "The boys will have to." Hosea said, "They will. They're good boys." Obi stood there a while, and then he said, "You buried me in my good shirt. I wanted the blue one." And Hosea, and this, friend, is why the Gap kept that man 50 years. Hosea said, "Obi, I am sorry. That was my doing and my mistake. If it is any comfort, the gray one suited you." And Obi Tolliver looked at him, and the fists came out of the pockets, and the jaw unclenched, and Hosea said the man just settled. Right there in front of him, like a pond going flat after a stone. And Obi said, "Well, I'll let you to it," and walked down the hill and around the wall, and Hosea said he never saw him again, and he believes to this day that all Obi Tolliver had been waiting on the whole year of walking was somebody to tell him the shirt was all right. Somebody to answer the small thing. The big thing, Hosea said, a man can sometimes carry. It is the small thing that wears a groove in him. The third one, Hosea would only tell me near dark, when the porch had gone cool and the whippoorwills had started down in the creek bottom. The third one was the reason he never married. Her name was Ruth Ann Breedlove. No relation, he said. The name was common enough in that country, though he allowed the coincidence had caught his attention the first time he dug her family's plot. She had died in 1921 in childbirth, along with the baby, and Hosea had buried them together, the baby in her arms, in the family plot on the west slope, in the kind sandy loam. She came to him on the hillside that June, and she was, he said, exactly what she had been, 24 years old, dark-haired, with a way of standing that made you think of a heron at the edge of water. And she did not know. She did not know anything had happened at all. She talked about her garden. She talked about her sister's wedding coming up in the fall. She talked about the baby, how she hoped for a girl, how her mother had a quilt half finished for it. And Hosea passed the time of day with her, and kept the rule, and walked her as far as the wall, which he had never done for anyone. And she said, "Well, I'll let you to it." And she went around the corner, and Hosea said he stood there and held onto that stone wall with both hands like a man holding onto a cliff. She came back for 11 years, longer than any of the others. Hosea never knew why some stayed a season and some stayed years, but Ruth Ann stayed 11, and in all that time she never asked, and he never told, and he said the two of them had, in a manner of speaking, the longest courtship in the history of Whetstone Gap, conducted entirely between a living man and a dead woman, neither of whom ever once said a word out of the ordinary. He told me he thought, sometimes, that she had known, at the end, that the last few years there had been something in her eyes on the morning she came. Not fear, not grief, just a kind of gentle patience, like a woman waiting at a depot for a train she can already hear coming. And the last morning he ever saw her, in the spring of 1932, she had stood with him by the west fence a long time without saying anything, and then she had said, "Hosea, you've been good company. I won't forget it." The same words, he said, that Delmar would use 26 years later, and he does not think that is a coincidence. He thinks that is what they say over there when they finally understand. And then she walked down the hill, and around the wall, and that was that. He never married. I asked him if that was why. He was quiet a long time, and then he said, "Son, when you have spent 11 years passing the time of day with the best woman you ever knew, the living ones afterward all seem to be talking about the wrong things." I did not ask him anything more about her. There are things a man tells you that you do not follow with questions. You just carry them. So that is the rest of Hosea Breedlove. Friend, the hillside, the rule, and 3 of the 52. A girl who worried about her mother. A man who needed to hear the shirt was all right. And a woman who stayed 11 years and said goodbye like a train pulling out. And I will tell you the thought I have had, the 40 years this story sat in my journal, the thought that finally made me understand it. It is this. We think the rule exists to protect the dead from the truth. But I have come to believe it is the other way around. I think the rule exists to protect the living. Because if it is true, if the ones who go sudden do not know and walk a while among us finishing their sentences, then every one of us has passed them. Every one of us has passed the time of day with somebody who was not, strictly speaking, there at a bus stop, on a porch, on a hillside. And the kindness we showed them or did not show them went somewhere. It counted. It was counted. So be kind to the stranger who talks about the weather a little too long, friend. Be patient with the old man who tells you the same thing twice. It costs you nothing. It costs you nothing at all. And one fine morning, when your own sentence breaks off in the middle, and it will, it breaks off in the middle for most of us, you may find yourself walking up out of a quiet place, onto some familiar ground, with your hat in your hands and no idea what day it is. And if you do, I hope there is a keeper on that hillside. I hope he knows your name, and I hope when you say morning, he puts down his scythe, and he says morning back, and he lets you think it's Tuesday, for as long as you need. Story 4. A man once told me, a lawyer, a quiet fellow with ink on his cuffs, that the dead don't leave their money to the living. They leave their debts. And sometimes, friend, the debt is not money at all. This story is about one of those times. Now listen close. This is how it was told to me and how I pass it to you. Her name was Marguerite Vane. In the autumn of 2009, she was 34 years old, an estate lawyer with a small practice in a logging town called Cedar Hollow, up in the Pacific Northwest, where the Douglas firs grow 200 feet tall, and the rain comes down 40 inches a year. And the sun, when it shows itself at all between October and May, is a pale gray rumor behind the clouds. Margaret did probate work, wills, trusts, the settling of estates. It was quiet work, careful work, the kind of work that suited her. She had grown up in that town, the daughter of a millwright, and she had gone away to law school, meaning never to come back, and had come back anyway, the way the tide comes back when her mother got sick and then died, and left her the little cedar shake house on the hill above the mill pond. So she stayed. She opened her practice above the hardware store. She handled the estates of loggers and fishermen and old widows, and she was good at it. And she was, in the way of people who have made their peace with a small life, mostly content. In October of 2009, a new client came to her, or rather, a new estate. The letter came from a firm in Seattle, a big marble and glass firm, and it said that a man named Aldous Crane had died, and that Marguerite Vane had been named in his will as the executor of his estate. and would she please contact the firm at her earliest convenience to begin the probate process. Marguerite had never heard of Aldous Crane. She had never, so far as she knew, done any work that would bring her to the attention of a Seattle firm. She called the number on the letter. A smooth voice confirmed everything. Aldous Crane, of something called Crane House, up the coast, estate valued. And here the voice paused politely, the way you pause before telling somebody their lottery numbers, at a little over $11 million. And she, Marguerite Vane of Cedar Hollow, population 1100, was the executor. And, the voice added, the sole heir. She sat at her desk for a long time after she hung up. She looked at the letter. She looked out her window at the mill pond, gray as slate, with the rain dimpling it. She thought, there has been a mistake. There had not been a mistake. She drove up the coast the following Tuesday to see the property, as an executor must. Crane House was 2 hours north of Cedar Hollow, at the end of a private road that wound through 5 miles of old-growth forest. Forest so old and so tall and so dark that driving through it, she told me later, felt less like driving than like sinking. And then the trees opened, and there was the house. It was a great dark pile of a place, built in 1891 by a timber baron, all black shingles and deep eaves and stone chimneys. 4 stories of it, standing in a clearing above a cove, with the sea beyond it, gray and enormous, and the rain coming down on it, and a single light burning in an upstairs window. It was, Marguerite said, the most beautiful house she had ever seen, and she did not want to go inside it. She went inside it. She was an executor. It was her job, the caretaker, an old woman named Mrs. Dove, let her in and gave her the keys and the alarm code and a tour of a kind. The house was full of things, full in a way Marguerite had never seen a house be full. Furniture under sheets, yes, but also books. Books everywhere. Not on shelves only, but in stacks, on the stairs, on the floor, on the mantels, in crates. Thousands of them. And clocks. Every room had a clock, and every clock was stopped. And every clock, she noticed on the second day, was stopped at the same time. 6:11. And there was the study on the 3rd floor where Aldous Crane had died. Died at his desk, Mrs. Dove said, peacefully in his sleep at the age of 93. And in the study there was a desk. And on the desk there was a single object, a brass ledger, big, leather-bound, old, and on top of the ledger, an envelope, and on the envelope, in a spidery old hand, to my executor. Read this first, then read the ledger, then burn the ledger. Do not do these things out of order. Marguerite Vane was a lawyer. She was a good lawyer. She was used to odd instructions in wills. She had once probated an estate that left a man's entire fortune to a parrot, and she knew that the correct procedure was to inventory everything, log everything, and follow the will's lawful instructions to the letter. She opened the envelope. Inside was a single sheet. I have it here, friend. She gave me a copy years later when she told me this story, and I have kept it. It reads, You do not know me. I knew your grandmother. I will not explain, and you must not try to find out. That is the one thing I ask that is not in the will, and I ask it as a favor. The estate is yours. The money is yours. The house is yours to sell. But there is one condition, and it is not a legal condition. No court will enforce it, and you may ignore it, and no one will ever know except you. It is this. In the ledger you will find a list of 112 names. They are written in many hands because they were written by the men and women themselves over many years. You must add your name to the list. That is all. Sign the ledger, last page. Any pen will do. Then burn the ledger in the study fireplace the same night you sign it. Do not keep it overnight unsigned, and do not keep it overnight signed. Sign it and burn it the same night you first open it. If you do this, the estate is yours clean, and you will be happy, and you will live a long time, and nothing will ever be asked of you again. If you do not, if you read the names, or keep the ledger, or fail to burn it, the estate is still legally yours. I could not prevent that, but it will not be clean. Choose freely. That is the whole of the inheritance. A choice made freely with full knowledge that you will never have full knowledge. I am sorry. It was the best I could do. A.C. Marguerite read this letter 3 times. Then she did the thing that she told me she would think about for the rest of her life. She thought, I am a lawyer. I do not sign things I have not read. She opened the ledger. She read the names. And here, friend, I must tell you what she told me, and I must tell it carefully, because Marguerite Vane was not a fanciful woman, and she knew how it sounded, and she told it to me plainly, with the flat affect of a person giving a deposition. The ledger was a guest book. That was the only way she could ever describe it. 112 names written across 112 years. The first signature dated 1891, the year the house was built. Each signature had a date beside it. And under most of the names, in the same many different hands, there was a single line of writing, and the line was always some small sentence, a few words. And as Marguerite turned the pages, reading the little sentences under the names, she began to understand what she was holding. Under the first name, Aldous Crane himself, 1891, the line read, I will keep the light. Under the second, I will mend the nets. Under the third, I will play for the dancers. They were promises, every one of them. 112 promises made by 112 people, each one small, each one homely. I will keep the light. I will mend the nets. I will play for the dances. I will teach the children their letters. I will keep the road. I will bake the bread. I will mind the goats. And as she read them, page after page, decade after decade, she began to feel the shape of the thing the ledger was. It was not a guest book. It was a crew list. It was a roll of obligations. 112 people had stood in that study over 112 years, and each of them had signed their name and taken up a task, and the tasks, small as they were, added up to something. Something the house needed. Something the house was. And the last page, the 113th space, was blank. Waiting, Marguerite closed the ledger. She did not sign it. She did not burn it. She put it in her briefcase, and she drove the 2 hours back to Cedar Hollow in the rain, and she put the ledger in the safe in her office, and she went home to her little cedar shake house, and she did not sleep. I will not tell you, friend, that she should have signed it. I have thought about this story for years, and I do not know what she should have done. She was asked to sign a promise she had not read, and she read it. And then she was asked to make a promise whose terms she did not understand, on the word of a dead man she had never met, concerning a house full of stopped clocks and 112 strangers who had promised to mend nets and mind goats. A lawyer does not sign that. A prudent person does not sign that. She did not sign that. She kept the ledger. That was the one instruction she broke completely. Not the signing, which she only declined, but the keeping. She kept it overnight. She kept it many nights. She told herself she was being diligent. She was researching. She was going to find out what Crane House was, and who Aldous Crane was, and what the promises meant, and then she would decide. And here is what happened while she researched. The first thing was the light. Marguerite went up to Crane House twice a week, that October and November, to inventory the estate. And every time she arrived, there was a single light burning in the upstairs window, the same window, the study window, and every time she had turned that light off herself at the end of her previous visit. The first time she thought nothing of it. The caretaker, perhaps. But Mrs. Dove, when asked, said she had not been up to the house in weeks. Her hip was bad, the stairs were too much. So the second time, Marguerite turned the study light off, and then she stood at the foot of the drive and watched the window. And as she watched, the light came on. She went back up. The study was empty. The lamp was on. She turned it off. She unplugged it. She carried the lamp downstairs and locked it in the trunk of her car. She drove home. The next visit, the study window was lit again, and when she went up, there was a different lamp burning. A brass student's lamp from the parlor, which had been in the parlor downstairs when she had left, and every clock in the study, which had been stopped at 6:11, was now stopped at 7:14. She wrote the times down. She was a lawyer. She documented. 6:11, 7:14, and over the following weeks, on each visit, the clocks had moved again, always stopped, never running, but stopped at a new time, and the new time was always later. 7:14, 8:09, 9:22. She wrote them all down, and it was not until she sat at her own kitchen table one night, looking at the column of times, that she understood what she was looking at. The clocks were keeping the time of night. Each visit, the house was a little later, as though the house were an evening friend, as though the house were one long evening that was slowly, visit by visit, drawing toward midnight. The second thing was the names. Marguerite had made a list, of course. She had read the ledger, and she had a lawyer's memory, and she had written down as many of the 112 names and promises as she could recall. And she did what a lawyer does. She looked them up. Old census records, county archives, the little historical society 2 towns south, and she found them. She found many of them. They were all real. They had all lived, at one time or another, within a day's travel of Crane House, and every one of them, without exception, had died in the same manner, drowned 112 people, across 112 years, and she found records for 61 of them, and all 61 had drowned. Fishermen lost off the bar, children gone off the rocks, a school teacher swept out by a rip current, a net mender, a baker, a woman who minded goats, a man who kept the light, the lighthouse keeper at the Point, 1903, drowned, every one of them, drowned. And the dates of their drownings, she laid them beside the dates of their signatures, told her the things she had most not wanted to know. They had all drowned after signing, not immediately. Some lived years, but every one of them, eventually, the sea took. Every promise in the ledger had been collected in the same coin. I will keep the light, and the sea will have me. I will mend the nets, and the sea will have me. The house gave them something. Marguerite never found out what the house gave them. Money, she supposed, like it was giving her. $11 million worth of something. And in return, each of them promised the house a task. And in the end, each of them was collected by the water, and their task passed on, and the next name was written. It was a crew list. It was a crew list for a ship that never sailed, a ship that was a house that was one long evening drawing toward midnight, and the crew kept the light and mended the nets and minded the goats, and one by one the sea took them, and the ledger waited, open, on a desk, for the next name. Marguerite Vane sat in her office above the hardware store, in the rain, with her documentation spread out in front of her, and she understood that she had not been left an inheritance. She had been sent a summons. The house had a place to fill, the 113th place, and it did not matter whether she signed or not. That was the thing she finally understood, the thing that made her put her head down on her desk in the middle of a Tuesday afternoon and weep. Signing was only the form. The reading had been the substance. She had read the names. She had learned the crew. And a crew list that has been read, friend, is a crew list that has been joined. The house did not need her signature. It only needed her to know what the house was. And now she knew. She drove up the coast that night. She did not plan to. She found herself on the coast road in the rain, the way a sleepwalker finds herself in the garden. The house was lit. Not one window now, but all of them, every window on all 4 stories, blazing, the whole great dark pile of it lit up like a ship at sea. She parked. She got out. The rain was coming down, and the sea was enormous and loud beyond the cove. And she walked up the steps, and the door was open. She went up to the study. She told me she does not remember deciding to go up. She remembers being on the stairs, and the stairs going on longer than stairs go on, and the books on the steps, and the stopped clocks in every room she passed. And she remembers that the clocks were all, now, stopped at the same time, all of them, every clock in the house, and the time was 11:58. The study door was open. The lamp was lit. The desk was clear except for 2 things, the brass ledger, which she had locked in her office safe, in Cedar Hollow, 2 hours south, and a pen. She stood in the doorway, and she said out loud to the empty room, "What is my task?" And here is the part of the story, friend, that I do not fully believe and cannot fully doubt. Marguerite told me that the ledger, which was closed, opened. She did not touch it. It lay on the desk, and it opened, slowly, the pages turning by themselves, all the way to the back, to the last page, to the 113th space. And on that space, which had been blank that morning, there was writing now, in a spidery old hand she knew from the letter. And the writing said, Marguerite Vane, and underneath her name, written before she ever signed, written before she ever agreed, written as though the house had always known, there was her task. I will settle the accounts. She told me she stood there a long time. She told me she thought about running, and she thought about the sea, and she thought about the 112, and how they had all drowned, every one, and how she had lived 2 hours from the sea her whole life, and had never once learned to swim, never once, in 34 years, though she could not have told you why, and she picked up the pen. She signed the ledger, and she did not burn it. She could not. The fireplace was cold, and the wood was wet, and she told me she believes the house would not have let her burn it anyway. The burning had been Aldous Crane's hope, the best he could do, a loophole he had tried to leave open, and the house had closed it. She signed, and the lamp flickered, and every clock in the house, all at once, all through the floors below her, and the floors above, began to tick. Marguerite Vane settled Aldous Crane's estate. She did it well. She was a good lawyer. The money came to her, all 11 million. She gave most of it away. She told me she could not spend it. It was not money. It was wages. She kept the little house in Cedar Hollow. She kept her practice. And she bought, up the coast, a small cottage, not Crane House. Crane House she could not sell. No buyer's offer ever quite closed. The papers always fell through. A small cottage within sight of the point, within sound of the sea. She lives there still, so far as I know. And she keeps the books now, not the law's books, the other ones. Every year or two, she told me, a letter comes from somewhere, addressed to her in a spidery old hand, and inside the letter is a name, a living person's name. Someone from the coast, someone from the towns. And Marguerite writes the name in a ledger of her own. She could not use the old one. The old one burned, after all, on a night she does not talk about. She does not dock at night. The clocks reached midnight. She writes the name, and under it she writes the task. And she does not know where the tasks come from. They simply come into her pen. And she posts the letter on, and the name goes out into the world. And a year later, or 5 or 10, the sea takes them. She settles the accounts. That is her task. That is the 113th promise. And she told me, this is the last thing, friend, the thing she told me at the end, in her cottage, with the sea loud outside and the rain coming down. She told me, I used to think the house was evil. I don't anymore. The house is a boat, and the boat has a crew, and the crew keeps the coast. I don't know what would happen if the crew ever ran out. I don't know what's out there, past the bar, in the dark, that 112 drowned people spent 112 years holding back by keeping a light and mending nets and minding goats. I only know the tasks work. The coast is quiet. The storms pass us by, mostly. And the price is a name now and then, a name and a task, and in the end, the water. I asked her how she could bear it. She looked at me a long time, and she said, because somebody has to settle the accounts. And then she said, the thing I will leave you with tonight. She said, when you go home, look through your family's papers. Everybody's got them. The box in the attic, the drawer in the desk. Look for a signature you don't recognize. Look for a promise. I will keep the light. I will mend the nets. In a hand that might be your grandmother's, or your grandfather's, or somebody's 100 years back. Because the crews are everywhere, friend. Crane House is not the only house. Every coast has one. Every valley, every range of hills. And the accounts have to be settled, generation after generation, and the names have to be found, and the finding is done by people like me. And the people like me are found by the ledgers. And the ledgers, she said, the ledgers are always looking. So check your attic. That's all. Check your attic. And if you find a ledger with a blank last page, you close it. You close it, and you put it back, and you forget you ever saw it, and you live your whole life 2 hours from the sea, and you never, ever learn to swim. Let me tell you a little more about Marguerite, friend, and about the town she came from, because you need to know the ordinariness of her before the extraordinary took hold of her. That is how these things work, I have found. They do not come for the dreamers. They come for the clerks. Cedar Hollow was a town of 1,100 souls strung along a single main street between the mill pond and the hill. There was the mill, shut down in the late 90s, reopened smaller in 2005, cutting half the timber it used to. And there was the hardware store and the grocery and the Coast Cafe and the VFW Hall and 2 churches and Marguerite's office above the hardware store, up a flight of stairs that groaned under every foot. Her office was one room and a closet. She had a desk her father had made her out of alder, a set of law books she mostly never opened anymore because everything was on the computer now, a filing cabinet, a coffee maker, and a window that looked down the hill to the mill pond. In the mornings, before her appointments, she would stand at that window with her coffee and watch the fog sit on the water and not move. Her days had a shape. She was at the office by 8. She answered letters. She drew up wills. The town was old and getting older, and a probate lawyer in a dying logging town is never idle. She ate lunch at the Coast Cafe most days, the soup, whatever it was, with half a sandwich. She walked home up the hill at 5:30. She made a simple supper. She read, or she watched the public television station, the only one that came in clear. She was in bed by 10. On Saturdays, she drove 40 minutes to see her father in his retirement apartment in the next town over, and they played cribbage, and he cheated, cheerfully. And she let him. She was not lonely, she told me, or not exactly. She had been engaged once, in law school, to a man who wanted Seattle and got it, and she had wanted. She said she had wanted a window and a mill pond and the fog sitting still on the water, and neither of them had been wrong, exactly, and it had ended without bitterness, the way a tide goes out. After that, she had not looked much. There was a vet in town, a good man, who had taken her to dinner a few times, and whom she liked and whom she did not, in the end, love, and she had told him so, gently, and they remained friendly, and he was the one who recommended her, years later, when the Seattle firm asked around for a careful executor on the coast. So, in a manner of speaking, friend, the whole thing came to her through an act of kindness she had done. A gentle no, said kindly, and I have never been able to decide whether there is a lesson in that or only a joke the world tells on us. The letter arrived on a Tuesday. I have told you what came after, but there are pieces of the middle I have not told you, and I will tell them now, because they are the pieces Marguerite herself dwelt on longest. The first piece is the funeral. Aldous Crane's funeral was held 3 days after Marguerite received the letter, in a little Episcopal church in the town nearest Crane House, and Marguerite attended as an executor should. She told me there were 11 people at the funeral, counting the minister and herself. 9 mourners. 9 for a man worth $11 million in a house full of books who had lived 93 years on that coast. And the 9 mourners, she said, were the strangest congregation she had ever stood among, and she could not have told you why. They were ordinary-looking people, an old woman in a good black coat, a middle-aged man in a fisherman's sweater, a young woman with a sleeping baby, a boy of maybe 10 in a suit that was too big for him. They did not speak to one another. They did not sit together. They sat scattered through the pews, each alone, and each of them, Marguerite said, cried, quietly, genuinely, the way you cry for somebody you loved. And afterward, at the grave, as the minister said the words, each of the 9 came forward, one by one, and each one laid something small on the coffin. A shell, a knot of rope, a child's drawing, a thimble, a dog's collar tag, and Marguerite, standing at the back, counted the offerings without meaning to, and counted 9, and thought nothing of it until, driving home that night in the rain, the number came back to her, and she pulled over on the coast road and sat with the engine running and the wipers going, and shook. 112 names in the ledger she had not yet read, 9 mourners, and she did not know then what the 9 were. Later she came to believe they were the ones whose tasks were still current, the living crew, the ones whose promises were still being kept, and that they had come, each one alone, to see the old captain buried. And she never spoke to any of them, and she never saw any of them again. And she said she is glad of that, and she does not examine why she is glad. The second piece is the library. In the weeks of her inventory, Marguerite spent long days in that house, and the books were unavoidable. There were, she estimated, 6,000 of them, and she began, out of a lawyer's instinct for the relevant document, to read the spines. They were not the books of a rich man's show library. They were old and used and strange, charts and tide tables going back to the 1700s, books of ship's logs, privately printed, volumes in languages she could not name, not French, not anything she had ever seen, alphabets that seemed to be made mostly of curves. And there was one shelf in the study, behind the desk, where the books were bound in the same brown leather as the ledger, and numbered 1 through 112. She did not open them. She told me she stood in front of that shelf for perhaps 10 minutes, and she understood that she was looking at the crew, that each volume was a person, or a person's account, a life written down and shelved. And she understood that if she opened one, she would not stop opening them, and that she would read them the way she had read the ledger, all the way through, and that the reading was the joining. So she did not open them, and she said the shelf, on every visit after that, seemed closer to the door than it had been, as though the house were slowly moving it toward her, or her toward it. The third piece is the letter I have not yet mentioned. Marguerite received in the spring of 2010. After the signing, after the night the clocks reached midnight, after she had taken up the task of settling the accounts, she received a letter from the Seattle firm, enclosing a final item from Aldous Crane's personal papers, which had been overlooked in the first inventory. It was a photograph in a frame and a note. The photograph was old, from the 1940s, by the look of it. It showed a young woman standing on the steps of Crane House in a summer dress, squinting a little into the sun, laughing at whoever held the camera. She was dark-haired. She had a gap between her front teeth. Marguerite knew that laugh. She had grown up in that laugh. It was her grandmother, her mother's mother, who had died when Marguerite was 9, and who had never, in any story Marguerite had ever been told, set foot anywhere near Crane House or its coast. And the note in the spidery hand said only, "She asked me to choose you when the time came. She said you would be the careful one. She was right. Forgive us both. A.C. Marguerite told me she does not know what her grandmother promised. The ledger, the first ledger, is ash. But somewhere, she believes, on that shelf of 112 brown volumes, behind the desk, in the study, in the house that is a ship, there is a book with her grandmother's name on the spine, and inside it, in her grandmother's hand, there is a small, homely sentence. I will keep the light. I will mend the nets. Something. She does not know what. And her grandmother, who lived 60 miles from that coast and never spoke of it, who grew tomatoes and sang alto in the Lutheran choir and died in her own bed at 81, her grandmother was crew, had been crew all along, and the position, when it came open, did not go out to strangers. It came down through the family the way debts do, the way the quiet lawyer told me on the porch of his office all those years ago. The dead leave their debts to the living. That, friend, is why Marguerite Vane tells the story at all. She told it to me on a condition, that I tell it when the time felt right to as many people as would listen at night by a fire in the rain. Because knowledge, she said, is the only raft there is. The ledgers are always looking. The houses are on every coast, and the only defense there has ever been, the only one, the one Aldous Crane tried to give her and she failed to take, is to close the book, to not read, to let the blank page stay blank, and the strange signature stay strange, and the old photograph stay in the attic with the question unasked. So I am telling you, friend, as she asked, the raft is knowledge, and the knowledge is this: some books must not be read, and some names must not be looked up, and some inheritances are only debts wearing good clothes. You know now, you are on the raft, and the raft, whatever else is true, is better than the water, ret easy. The rain is steady, and the fire is low and warm, and there is one more story in me tonight, the last one, and in some ways the oldest one, and then I will bank the coals and let you go. Story 5. I heard this last one a long time ago, and from a man who had no business knowing it, and I have saved it for the end of the night because it is, of all the stories I carry, the one that walks closest behind me. The man was an old traveling preacher named Reverend Abednego Sorrow. That was the name he gave, and I have never been sure it was the name he was born with. And he told it to me in the winter of 1974 at a little gospel mission in South Georgia, where we had both taken shelter from the same cold rain. Now listen close. This is how he told it, best as I can pass it to you. In the autumn of 1923, Abednego Sorrow was a young man of 26, and he was a circuit preacher in the low country of Georgia. The flat, wet country down along the coast, where the rivers spread out into marshes a mile wide, and the cypress stand in black water up to their knees. And the little settlements sit on hammocks of high ground like boats at anchor. He had a circuit of 11 churches, most of them one-room brush arbor affairs, and he rode it on a mule named Testament, and it took him 6 weeks to make the full round, and he had made the round 9 times, and he knew every creek crossing, and every ferryman, and every farmhouse that would feed a preacher, and every one that would set the dog on him. The settlement this story concerns was called Mercy Landing. It was the smallest place on his circuit. 9 families, 20-some souls, on a hammock of high ground out in the middle of the marsh, reachable only by a corduroy road, a road made of logs laid side by side across the wet that ran 1.5 miles from the nearest dry land. The church at Mercy Landing was a one-room plank building with a tin roof, built, the people said, by a preacher named Calder some 40 years before, who had come out to the hammock, preached a while, built the church with his own hands, and then, the people said, and they said it careful, gone on. Young Reverend Sorrow had preached at Mercy Landing 6 times before the autumn this happened. It was the strangest stop on his circuit, and he had known it from the first, though he could not have said why. The people were kind. They fed him well. They sang like angels. The marsh people of that country had voices, friend, voices that could raise the hair on your arms, and the singing at Mercy Landing was the best on his whole circuit. And yet, there was a feeling to the place, a thickness in the air. He told me he had put it down to the marsh, to the still water, and the heat and the smell of it, and perhaps, at first, that was all it was. But in October of 1923, he rode out the corduroy road for his autumn visit, and he noticed, about a half-mile in, that something was wrong with the road. The corduroy road to Mercy Landing ran straight. It had to run straight. It had been laid across open marsh, from dry land to the hammock, in one long line, and Sorrow had ridden it 6 times, and it was straight as a rifle shot, and it took at Testament's steady walking pace almost exactly 30 minutes to cross. He knew this because he always checked his watch at the near end, out of a preacher's habit of minding the time, and he always arrived at the hammock within a minute or two of the half hour. That October morning, he checked his watch at the near end, 8:42, and he rode out onto the logs, and the marsh spread out on either side of him, gray and gold in the morning light. And the birds were quiet, which he noticed, and the water was still, which he noticed, and he rode. He rode for 30 minutes. He checked his watch, 9:12, and ahead of him, where the hammock should have been, where the high ground should have risen out of the marsh with its 9 cabins and its 1 church, there was more road. The corduroy road simply went on, straight as ever, into the marsh, and the marsh went on around it, flat and shining, to the horizon. He stopped the mule. He looked behind him. The dry land he had left was still there, close, a half-mile back. He could see the trees on it. He looked ahead. No hammock, no Mercy Landing, just road and marsh and sky. He told me he did the thing that men do. He told himself he had misjudged. He had been wool-gathering, perhaps. A preacher rides a long way alone, and his mind wanders, and the hammock was simply further than he remembered. He rode on. He rode another 30 minutes. He checked his watch, 9:42. The dry land behind him was still close. He could still see the trees. He had been riding an hour on a road that crossed 1.5 miles of marsh, and the land behind him was a half-mile back, and the land ahead of him did not exist. He turned the mule around, and here, friend, is where Reverend Sorrow's voice, telling it 50 years later in that gospel mission, went low and slow, and he looked at the fire and not at me. He said, I rode back toward the dry land, and I rode for an hour, and the dry land did not come any closer. He stopped the mule again. He stood up in the stirrups. The dry land was there, a half-mile, the same half-mile, close enough to see the trees, close enough to see the smoke from a chimney. Close enough, he said, that if he had shouted, a man on that shore would have turned his head, and he had ridden toward it for an hour, and it had not come closer, and the road under him was the same road, and the marsh on either side was the same marsh, and the sun was where the sun should be, and nothing at all was different, except that the road had stopped going anywhere. He said he did not panic. He was a preacher, and a preacher in that country, in that time, had seen hard things. And besides, he said, there is a kind of fear that is too large to panic in. You do not scream in it. You go quiet in it, the way you go quiet in church. He sat down on the logs. He took out his Bible, and then, he said, he heard singing. It came from ahead of him, down the road that would not arrive at the hammock. It was the singing of Mercy Landing. He knew it at once, knew those voices, the best singing on his circuit. And it was a hymn he knew, and it was beautiful, and it was close, and there was nothing there. No church, no cabins, just road and marsh and the singing rising up out of nowhere, close enough that he could make out the words. And the words, friend. The words were wrong. He said it took him a verse or two to hear it, because the tune was right, and the voices were right, and his ear wanted the words to be right. But they were not right. The hymn was one he had sung all his life, and I will not tell you its name, friend, and you will forgive me, because sorrow made me promise that, and some promises outlive the men who ask for them. The hymn was one he had sung all his life, and every word of it was in its place, and every word of it was backwards. Not garbled, not nonsense. The hymn, sung precisely, word by word, from the last word to the first. He sat on the logs of that road, in the middle of the marsh, and he listened to a church he could not see sing a hymn backwards, in voices he knew, for what he said might have been 10 minutes or an hour. And then the singing stopped, and in the quiet after it, he heard footsteps on the logs, coming toward him from ahead, from where the hammock should have been, and around a bend that had not been in the road a moment before, came Brother Calder. Now, Sorrow knew Calder by reputation only, the way you know a name that people say careful, the preacher who had come out to the hammock 40 years before, who had built the church with his own hands, who had gone on. And here he came, walking the corduroy road, an old man in a black coat with a Bible under his arm, and he came up to where Sorrow sat, and he looked down at him, and he said, in a voice that was kind and tired and very old, "You're early, son. We haven't built the road yet." Sorrow said, "Brother Calder, the road is here. I'm sitting on it." And Calder looked down at the logs, and he smiled a small, sad smile, and he said, "You're sitting on the idea of it. Sit easy a minute. Let me tell you how it is." And Sorrow, said the old man, sat down beside him on the logs, there in the middle of the marsh, and he opened his Bible, and the Bible, Sorrow said, was blank, every page of it white as milk. And Calder turned the blank pages as he talked, like a man reading, and this is what he told the young preacher. He said, "Mercy Landing is gone, son. It went under. Not the water would have been a mercy. It went under the other way. 40 years ago I came out here, and I built a church on that hammock, and the people came, and they sang, and I preached. And I was young and proud, and I wanted a miracle, son. I wanted the marsh to bloom. And one night at the altar I prayed for it. I prayed for a door to open, for the kingdom to come near, for the veil to get thin right here, right on this hammock, so these poor wet people could see through it, and the prayer was answered. That is the thing nobody tells you, son. Some prayers are answered. The door opened, the veil got thin, and Mercy Landing went through it. The whole hammock, 9 families, the church, the singing. It went through the door I opened, and it is still going through 40 years on, and it will be going through forever, because the door only opens one way, and it opens slow. And the road is the hinge of the door, son. That is why it runs straight. Straight things are hinges. And every so often the door swings a little, and a traveler comes out onto the road at the wrong moment, and the road has nowhere to go, because one end of it is in this world and the other end of it is in that one, and in between there is only the door, swinging. Sorrow said he sat very quiet, and then he said, "Brother Calder, why are you still here?" And the old man turned a blank page of his Bible, and he said, "Because somebody has to mind the door, son. Somebody has to stand on the hinge and keep count of what goes through, and turn back what can be turned back. I opened it. It is mine to mind. That is only fair." And Sorrow said, and he told me his mouth was dry as cotton when he said it, he said, "And me, Brother Calder, have I gone through?" And old Calder looked at him, and Sorrow said it was the kindest look he ever got from any man, before or since, And Calder said, "Not all the way, son, not all the way. You are on the hinge, like me, but you got something I don't have any more." And he reached out, and he touched Sorrow's chest, over his heart, and he said, "You got a body that hasn't decided yet. So here is what you do. You get on that mule, you turn him around, you ride toward the far shore, not the near one, the far one, the one that isn't there, and you do not look behind you, not once, and you do not listen to the singing, not one word of it. And when the singing gets loud, and it will get loud, son, it will get loud enough to crack your heart, you sing louder. You sing the hymn the right way round. The right way round, son. First word to last. It is the only rope there is. And when the mule's feet touch dry ground, you get down and you put your hand on the ground, and you thank God, and you never ride out onto that marsh again. Sorrow said he did it. He got on Testament. He turned the mule toward the empty horizon where no hammock stood. He rode. The singing started behind him, close, in the voices he knew, backwards, and it got louder, and it got louder, until it seemed to him the whole marsh was singing, the water and the birds and the cypress and the sky, and he opened his mouth, and he sang the hymn the right way round, first word to last, as loud as a young man can sing, which in that country, friend, was loud. And the road went on, and the marsh went on, and he sang, and he did not look back, and at some point, he could never say when, the singing behind him began to get soft, and the light changed, and Testament's hooves came down off the logs onto mud, and then onto grass, and the mule stopped and stood and breathed. Sorrow got down. He put his hand on the ground. He thanked God, and then he looked around him. He was on the hammock. He was at Mercy Landing. The 9 cabins stood around him, and the church stood in the middle, with its tin roof bright in the sun. And there was no one there. He said the cabins were empty. Cold stoves made beds, doll on a doorstep, a plate on a table, with a meal half eaten and 40 years of dust on it. And the church door stood open, and inside the church, on every pew, the hymnals were open, all of them, everyone, open to the same hymn. He did not go in. He got back on the mule. He rode the corduroy road back to the dry land. 30 minutes, his watch said, the ordinary 30 minutes, as though the road had spent the morning somewhere else and was sorry. And he never rode out onto that marsh again. He finished his circuit that autumn, and in the spring he asked the conference for a new territory, inland, and they gave it to him. And he preached 50 more years in the hill country, and he never once, he told me, preached about doors. He told me that story in 1974 at the Gospel Mission, and when he was done, I did what you are doing. Friend, I sat quiet a while, and then I said, Reverend, do you believe it happened that way? And he gave me the answer that I give you now. At the end of the night, at the end of the last story, he said, Son, I will tell you the 2 things I know. The first is that I never rode that marsh again, and I counseled every preacher who came after me to leave Mercy Landing off the circuit, and one of them did not listen, a young fellow in 1931, and he rode out the corduroy road one October morning, and his mule came back at dark with an empty saddle, and they never found the boy, and his name was, and here the old man stopped, and he looked at the fire, and he said, No, I won't say his name. Some names you don't say out loud over a marsh. He might still be riding and listening. And I said, What's the second thing you know, Reverend? And old Abednego Sorrow stood up, and he banked the mission fire, and he picked up his blanket roll, and he said, The second thing I know is that it is 40 years gone, and I can still hear it. Some nights, when the rain is right, the singing from wherever the door is now. And son, he said, it is further along than it used to be. The hymn is longer backwards than it is forwards. I have counted, and every year, on some night in October, there is one more verse of it than there was the year before. The door is still swinging, the landing is still going through, and the singing is getting closer to the end of the hymn. And I do not know, he said, from the door of the mission, with the cold rain blowing in past him. I do not know what happens when they finish it. Nobody knows, because nobody who was there when it started has ever heard the last word. And he said, so if you take anything from an old preacher, son, take this. Sing your hymns the right way round, first word to last. Always. It is a small thing. It costs you nothing. And a rope, friend, is a small thing too, until it is the only thing between you and the drop. Then he went out into the rain, and I never saw him again. And that, friend, is the last story I have for you tonight. Rest now. Let it all go quiet. The fire is low, and the rain is steady, and the night is nearly spent, and whatever doors there are in this world, none of them are in this room. This room is only a room, and you are only a listener, and I am only an old man by a fire, and the night is only a night. Sleep now, sleep deep, first word to last. Let me tell you a little more about Reverend Sorrow and about that low country, friend, because the land itself is half the story, and a man is the other half, and you cannot understand what happened on that corduroy road until you have both. The Georgia Low Country in 1923 was a country unto itself. It did not much belong to the rest of the state, and the rest of the state did not much want it. It was water, mostly, black water, brown water, water that stood, and water that crept, water with cypress in it, and water with rice stubble in it, and water with things in it that the people did not name. The settlements sat on hammocks, trees, which is what they called the little islands of high ground out in the marsh. And some of those hammocks had been lived on since before the Revolution, and some of them had graveyards older than the nation, and the people who lived on them were a mix of everybody the Low Country had ever held. Old Scots and old Africans and old Huguenots and old souls of no name at all, and they had their own ways and their own God, who was mostly the God of the book, but had picked up, along the way, a certain marshiness. A circuit preacher in that country was part pastor, part doctor, part letter writer, part judge. Sorrow married people. He buried people. He wrote letters for people who could not write, and read letters for people who could not read. He sat with the dying, and he baptized the new, and he settled, on 2 occasions he told me of, disputes over hogs that would otherwise have come to shotguns. He carried, always, his Bible, a Barlow knife, a tin of salve, a sack of peppermints for the children, and a .32 revolver that he had used exactly once on a cottonmouth and hoped never to use on anything that walked on 2 legs. He was, he told me, a good preacher in those years, young, strong-voiced, certain. The certainty, he said, is what the marsh took from him, not his faith. His faith came through it, and was, he said, the only thing that did. But the certainty, the young man's idea that the world was a book, and he had been given the reading of it, that stayed out there on the corduroy road, with the singing. He never got it back. He said he preached better without it. The people of Mercy Landing, he told me, deserve a word of their own, because they were not phantoms to him. They were his flock, and he knew their names, And he said their names to me that night in the mission, all 9 families. And I will not write them all here, friend, but I will tell you of 2, because he dwelt on 2. The first was the DeLegal family, old Mom Suki DeLegal and her grown son Paris. Mom Suki was, Sorrow said, the nearest thing the hammock had to a head woman. She was Gula, descended from the Rice Coast people, and she knew the marsh the way Hosea Breedlove knew his hillside, knew it by root and tide. She had a way of looking at sorrow, he said, from the very first visit, that he could never quite read. A look that was kind and sorry at the same time, the look you give a man who has walked in with mud on his boots that he cannot see. And it was Mom Suki who said to him on his 3rd visit, a thing he did not understand until the October morning on the road. She had walked him out to the head of the corduroy road at dusk, which nobody had ever done before, and she had stood with him looking down the long straight line of it across the marsh. And she had said, "Reverend, you a good preacher. You preach fine, but you listen to me now. When you ride that road, you ride it in daylight. You hear singing, you don't follow it. You see the church from the road before you see the cabins. You turn around, and Reverend," she said, "if the road ever takes you longer than the half hour, you don't stop. You don't get down. You keep your eyes front and you ride, and you let Testament do the knowing. Mule knows the road. Mule always did." And Sorrow had said gently, the way a young certain man says it, "Mom Suki, it's a straight road across a marsh. There isn't anywhere to get lost on it." And she had looked at him with that kind, sorry look, and she had said, "That ain't the losing I'm talking about, Reverend. That ain't the losing I'm talking about." The second was the church itself and its singing. Sorrow told me he had asked, once on his 4th or 5th visit, where the people had learned to sing that way, because it was not the singing of any church he knew. It was not shape note, and it was not the lining out of the old Baptists, and it was not the ring shout of the praise houses, though it had something of all 3. It was, he said, the sound of a congregation singing in a room bigger than the room they were in, and old Paris DeLegal, Mom Suki's son, had answered him, and Sorrow said he had thought nothing of the answer at the time, and had thought of little else in the 50 years since. Paris had said, "We learned it from the church, Reverend. Same as you preach in it. You ever notice how the preaching sounds better in there than it does anywhere else on your circuit? How your voice fills it up fuller than it ought. How you get to the end of a sermon in there and you don't rightly remember the middle of it. That's the church, Reverend. It sings back. It always did sing back. Calder didn't build it so much as he tuned it. He did not tell me, friend, whether he ever fully believed that. He told me only what he saw, and what he heard, and what Mom Suki said, and what Paris said, and what old Calder said on the hinge of the door. He was a careful witness. He gave me the pieces and let me carry them. There is one more piece. It is the piece I have carried the most quietly of all, and I will give it to you now, at the end, because the night is nearly spent, and you are half asleep, and the half asleep hear things the wide awake cannot. Sorrow told me that in the winter of 1971, 3 years before he and I took shelter in the same mission, he had been an old man of 74, preaching in the hill country, far from any marsh, and one Sunday he had a funeral for an old woman of his congregation, and at the graveside, as was the custom, the people sang, and they sang a hymn, a common hymn, one of the great ones, one Every congregation knows. And Sorrow stood at the head of the grave with his hat off, in the cold hill wind, and he listened and he heard it. Under the singing, under the right way round singing of his hill congregation, 40 voices strong, he heard the other singing, the backwards hymn, far off, faint, the way you hear a train across a valley at night. He said he did not turn his head. He said he knew better. He stood at the grave, and he looked at the box, and he heard the backwards hymn under the forwards one, and when the singing ended, it ended. And he went on with the words over the grave, and nobody there knew anything had happened, and he told no one. But that night, in his little parsonage, he got out a thing he had kept for 50 years. He got out his old circuit journal, the one from 1923, and he turned to the last page of it, where, on the night after he came off the corduroy road, he had written down the words of the backwards hymn as far as he had heard them before the singing stopped. He had written them, and he had never read them since. And now, at 74, the backwards singing coming back to him across 50 years at a hill country graveside, he read them, and he told me, friend, what he found. The backwards hymn, as the people of Mercy Landing sang it, word by word from last to first, was not just the hymn reversed. Read backwards, it made other words. It made a different song. It made, he said, and his voice at the mission fire was barely above the rain. It made an invitation. Every verse of the backwards hymn, read as it came, was a verse of welcome. Come through. The door is open. The water is warm. The road runs both ways. That is what Mercy Landing had been singing all those years in those beautiful voices in the church that sang back. Not a hymn, a door held open by a song. And the last verse, the verse he had never heard, the verse that got one verse longer every October, the verse that was still coming. Sorrow said he did not know the words of it, but he knew, the way an old preacher knows a text he has not yet been given, what it would say when it came. It would say the same thing every open door says, in the end, to the man standing on the hinge of it. It would say his name. That is why he would not tell me the hymn's name, friend, and why I will not tell you either. Because some of you tonight are half asleep, and some of you will dream, and in a dream a person will sing whatever song comes to them, and a person singing in a dream does not always check which way round the words are going. So we will leave the hymn nameless, you and I. We will let it rest in its marsh, and we will close the night the way old Sorrow closed every night of his last 50 years, with the words he spoke to me last at the mission door. As he stepped out into the rain, he said, "The door only opens one way, son, but it opens towards singing. Remember that. If you ever hear it, if you're ever on a straight road in flat country, in the wet part of the world, and the birds go quiet, and the water goes still, and you hear voices singing something beautiful that you almost know, you do not stop to find the words. You ride on. You ride on, and you sing your own song, the plain way, the right way round, first word to last. And you do not stop until your feet touch ground that has a graveyard on it, ground where the dead lie still and know their names. That ground is holy, son. That ground will hold you. Ret now. It is over. The stories are told, and the fire is low, and the door of this little cabin is shut fast against the rain, and there is nothing singing outside it tonight but the rain itself. And the rain, friend, has no words at all. That is the kindest thing about it. It has no words at all. The fire's down to a red glow now, friend, The rain's still falling, soft as ever, and it'll be falling when you wake. If your eyes are still open, close them now. Let my voice go quiet. If you drifted off somewhere back along the way, I hope the stories carried you somewhere gentle. I'll be right here tomorrow night. Same chair, same fire, same old rain. Come back and sit with me again. Rest now, sleep deep. Good night, friend.